Every child deserves to feel safe, and every heart deserves to feel wanted. But on the coldest night of winter, 5-year-old Josie runs from another foster home where love never lived, finding herself in a snow-covered alley behind Murphy's Tavern. There she discovers a golden retriever, abandoned and shivering after his owner's arrest. Through her tears, Josie whispers to the dog, "You need a friend, and I need a family." Helen Morrison, a lonely widow in her late 60s, finds them both. On her front porch the next morning, Helen lost her own family years ago when her grown son walked away after a bitter argument. Now 3 broken souls have found each other. Can they learn to trust again and become the family none of them thought they could have? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Helen Morrison's morning routine had become a ritual of quiet solitude over the past 7 years. At 68, she moved through her modest 2-story home with the deliberate pace of someone who had learned that rushing served no purpose when there was nowhere urgent to go. The hardwood floors creaked their familiar greeting as she descended the stairs, her slippered feet finding the worn spots that marked decades of the same path. The kitchen held the gentle aroma of yesterday's coffee and the faint sweetness of the apple pie she'd baked for no one in particular. Through the frost-etched window above her sink, she could see the snow continuing to fall, blanketing Maple Street in the kind of pristine white that made the world seem hushed and waiting. Her neighbors' houses stood like silent sentinels, their windows glowing with the warm light of families beginning their day. She filled the kettle with practiced efficiency, her wedding ring catching the early light. 22 years of marriage. To Robert, gone now for a decade. The ring had become lighter over the years, or perhaps her finger had simply grown accustomed to its weight. She still reached for 2 mugs from the cabinet before remembering, still set the table for 2 before catching herself in the old habit. The manila envelope on her kitchen counter drew her attention as it had every morning for the past month. Inside were the pamphlets about senior living communities that her friend Margaret had brought over, well-meaning but unwelcome. "Helen, you're rattling around in this big house like a marble in a jar," Margaret had said. "Wouldn't it be nice to have people around? Activities, meals prepared for you?" Helen understood the logic. The house was too large for one person, too quiet, too full of memories that sometimes felt more real than the present. But the thought of leaving felt like abandoning the last physical connection to the life she'd built with Robert, the life that had included their son Michael, until that terrible argument 7 years ago. The argument that had torn her family apart still played in her mind with painful clarity. Michael had been 31 then, struggling with his new marriage and the pressures of starting his career as a lawyer. He'd come to her seeking advice, or perhaps just understanding, about his fears of becoming a father. Sarah was pregnant with their first child, and Michael was terrified he wouldn't be good enough. "What if I mess everything up, Mom?" he'd asked, sitting at this very kitchen table. "What if I'm not patient enough or loving enough? Or what if I say the wrong thing and damage them forever?" Helen had meant to reassure him, to share the wisdom that comes from years of loving imperfectly but completely. Instead, exhausted from months of watching him struggle with anxiety and self-doubt, she'd said the words she would regret for the rest of her life. "Maybe you're right to worry. Maybe you should wait until you're more mature, more ready. Having a child isn't something you do when you're this uncertain." The silence that followed had been deafening. Michael's face had crumpled, then hardened. "I thought you'd support me," he'd said quietly. "I thought my own mother would believe in me. That's not what I meant." "Yes, it is." He'd stood then, gathering his coat with movements sharp with hurt. "You don't think I'm ready to be a father. You don't think I'm good enough." "Michael, please." But he was already at the door. "When you think I'm worthy of being a parent, you can meet your Grandchild, until then we have nothing to discuss. That was the last conversation they'd had. Emma had been born 6 months later. Helen had learned about her granddaughter's existence through a neighbor who'd seen the birth announcement in the local paper. She'd driven past Michael's house countless times over the years, catching glimpses of a little girl with her son's dark hair playing in the front yard, but pride and hurt had built a wall between them that seemed impossible to climb. The sound of whimpering outside pulled Helen from her memories. She set down her untouched tea and moved to the front door, expecting to find a stray cat or perhaps a neighbor's escaped pet. Instead, she discovered something that made her heart catch in her throat. Huddled against her front door were a small child and a large golden retriever, both shivering in the morning cold. The child, a little girl with tangled blonde hair and wearing a coat too thin for the weather, was pressing her small body against the dog's fur for warmth. The dog, despite its own obvious distress, had positioned himself as a windbreak for the child. "Oh, my goodness," Helen breathed, immediately kneeling beside them. "Sweetheart, what are you doing out here?" The little girl looked up with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. "We don't have anywhere else to go," she said simply. "Buddy was cold, and your porch has a roof." Helen's maternal instincts, dormant but never dead, surged to life. "Let's get you both inside right now. You must be freezing." She ushered them through the door, the dog moving slowly but protectively beside the child. In the warmth of her living room, Helen could see them more clearly. The girl couldn't be more than 5, with a heart-shaped face and clothes that were clean but ill-fitting. The dog was a beautiful golden retriever, older and bearing a worn leather collar, but gentle-eyed and clearly devoted to his small companion. "What's your name, honey?" Helen asked, wrapping a throw blanket around the child's shoulders. "Josie," the girl replied, her teeth still chattering. "This is Buddy. He needed a friend, and I needed a family, so we found each other." The simple statement hit Helen like a physical blow. She remembered being 5 years old herself, remembered the clarity with which children could see essential truths that adults complicated with fear and doubt. This little girl and this dog had found each other in their need, had created a family of 2 souls against the cold world. "Where did you come from, Josie?" Helen asked gently, settling onto the couch beside her unexpected guests. "The place where the man yells a lot," Josie said, unconsciously moving closer to Buddy. "Mrs. Patterson's house. She takes care of kids like me, but she doesn't like kids very much. And the man she lives with drinks the angry juice and yells at everyone." Helen's blood chilled. A foster home, clearly, and not a good one. "How long were you outside, sweetheart?" "Since it got dark. We slept under the stairs behind the place, where people drink." Josie's hand found Buddy's fur, and the dog pressed closer to her. Buddy was tied up there, and he was crying because his person went away and never came back. So I untied him, and we kept each other warm. The story was becoming clearer, and Helen's heart was breaking with each detail. A child running from an abusive foster situation, finding an abandoned dog, the 2 of them surviving a winter night through mutual protection and companionship. It was the kind of story that appeared in newspapers as either tragedy or miracle, depending on how it ended. "Are you hungry?" Helen asked, though she already knew the answer from the way Josie's eyes had fixed on the apple pie cooling on the counter. 20 minutes later, Helen watched as Josie ate scrambled eggs and toast with the desperate efficiency of someone who didn't know when the next meal might come. Buddy lay at the child's feet, occasionally accepting small offerings of toast, but mostly serving as a warm, reassuring presence. Helen had filled a bowl with water for the dog and was pleased to see that despite his obvious hunger, Buddy waited for Josie's permission before drinking. "Josie," Helen said carefully, sitting across from her at the kitchen table, "I need to call some people to help us figure out what's best for you and Buddy." Fear flashed across the child's face. "Are you going to send us back?" "No, sweetheart, but there are people whose job it is to make sure children are safe and cared for properly. They need to know you're okay. They're the ones who put me with Mrs. Patterson." Josie said quietly. They said it was temporary, but it felt forever. Helen reached across the table and gently took Josie's small hand. Sometimes the people who are supposed to help make mistakes. But I promise you, I won't let anyone separate you and Buddy, and I won't let anyone put you somewhere you don't feel safe. It was a promise she had no legal authority to make, but looking into those trusting eyes, Helen knew she would move heaven and earth to keep it. Something had awakened in her that had been sleeping since Michael walked out of her life. The fierce protectiveness of someone who had been called to care for another soul. As if summoned by the thought of community support, Helen heard the familiar tap on her back door that announced the arrival of her neighbor, Mrs. Chen. At 73, Linda Chen possessed the kind of practical wisdom that comes from raising 4 children and outliving one husband while maintaining her sense of humor and her legendary garden. "Helen, dear, I saw tracks in the snow leading to your—" Mrs. Chen stopped short as she entered the kitchen and took in the scene. Her eyes, sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, quickly assessed the situation. The small child, the large dog, the protective way they sat close together, and the determined set of Helen's shoulders. "Well," Mrs. Chen said, hanging her coat on the back of a chair and settling in as if she'd been expected. "I see we have some new neighbors. I'm Linda Chen and I live next door. Who might you two be?" "I'm Josie, and this is Buddy," the child replied, some of her wariness easing in the face of Mrs. Chen's matter-of-fact acceptance. "Pleased to meet you both. Helen, I assume we're having a situation that requires coffee and strategic planning." Helen felt a wave of gratitude for her friend's immediate understanding and support. "We are indeed." As Helen prepared coffee for the adults and hot chocolate for Josie, Mrs. Chen engaged the child in gentle conversation about Buddy's needs. Her own experiences with dogs and the importance of making sure all members of a family, even temporary ones, felt safe and welcome. Her approach was perfect, treating Josie as someone whose opinions mattered while gathering information about their situation. "The thing about families," Mrs. Chen said, scratching Buddy behind the ears, "is that they come in all different shapes and sizes. Some are the kind you're born into, and some are the kind you choose, or the kind that chooses you. The important thing is that everyone takes care of everyone else." Josie nodded solemnly. "That's what me and Buddy do. I can see that. He's lucky to have found such a good friend." Helen rejoined them at the table, her mind already working through the practical necessities. She would need to contact social services, but carefully, with emphasis on keeping Josie and Buddy together. She would need to understand the legal requirements for emergency foster placement, the implications for Buddy's custody, and how to navigate a system she'd never had reason to learn. But first, she needed to make sure both her unexpected guests felt secure enough to trust her with their story. Looking at Josie's small hand resting on Buddy's head, seeing the way the dog's eyes never left the child's face, Helen understood that she wasn't just dealing with a foster care situation. She was looking at a bond that had already become a family, fragile and new, but real in the way that mattered most. The morning sun was rising higher now, casting warm light through her kitchen windows and illuminating what felt like the beginning of something entirely unexpected. At 68, Helen Morrison had thought her days of nurturing and protecting were behind her. But sometimes life offers second chances when we least expect them, in the form of a small child and a gentle dog, who understood that love is not about blood or paperwork, but about choosing to care for each other when the world feels cold and uncertain. The official knock came at 2:30 that afternoon, sharp and authoritative in the way that government representatives announce themselves. Helen had been expecting it since her morning phone call to the Department of Children and Family Services, but her heart still jumped at the sound. Josie, who had been quietly coloring at the kitchen table while Buddy dozed at her feet, went rigid with fear. "It's okay, sweetheart," Helen said softly, moving to answer the door. "Remember what we talked about. I'm going to handle this." Through the frosted glass, Helen could see the silhouette of a woman in a professional coat, briefcase in hand. She took a deep breath and opened the door to find a Hispanic woman in her 40s with kind but tired eyes and the efficient demeanor of someone who dealt with family crises every day. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm Maria Rodriguez, caseworker with DCFS. We spoke on the phone this morning about the child you found." "Yes, please come in." Helen stepped aside, noting how Ms. Rodriguez's eyes immediately swept the room, taking inventory with professional thoroughness. "Josie is in the kitchen. She's been worried about what happens next." Ms. Rodriguez nodded, following Helen through the living room. Her gaze lingered on the family photos on the mantel, the well-maintained furniture, the general sense of warmth and stability that Helen's home projected. When they reached the kitchen, she paused at the sight of Josie and Buddy, still pressed close together, both watching the newcomer with wary attention. "Hello, Josie," Ms. Rodriguez said, her voice gentling as she addressed the child. "I'm Maria. I work with children to make sure they have safe places to live. Can you tell me what happened last night?" Josie's hand tightened on Buddy's fur. "I don't want to go back to Mrs. Patterson's house." "Why don't you want to go back there?" For a moment, Josie was silent, and Helen could see the internal struggle, the ingrained fear of adult authority warring with the desperate need to be heard. Finally, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "The man there drinks the bottles and gets angry. He threw things at the wall and yelled at Mrs. Patterson, and she got scared and yelled at us kids. Tommy got hit because he was crying, and I was afraid Buddy would get hurt if they found him." Ms. Rodriguez was taking notes, her expression growing, more serious with each detail. "Who is Tommy?" "Another kid like me. He's 7 and he wets the bed sometimes, and Mrs. Patterson gets real mad about washing sheets." Helen felt her hands clench into fists. She had taught elementary school for 30 years. She knew the signs of a child living in fear, but hearing it described so matter-of-factly by someone so young made her want to march directly to the Patterson home and have words with the adults responsible for Josie's care. "What about Buddy?" Ms. Rodriguez asked, glancing at the dog who hadn't moved from Josie's side. "Where did you find him?" "Behind Murphy's Tavern. He was tied to a post and crying. His person got taken away by police and nobody came back for him. He was cold and scared, just like me." Josie's voice grew stronger as she talked about rescuing Buddy. "We kept each other warm all night. He's my family now." Ms. Rodriguez looked up from her notes, studying the bond between child and dog with professional interest. "Josie, I need to explain some things to you. There are rules about where children can live and who can take care of them. Mrs. Morrison is a very nice lady, but she hasn't been approved as a foster parent yet." "What does that mean?" Josie asked, though Helen could see in her eyes that she already suspected it meant separation. "It means we need to find you a temporary place to stay while we sort things out properly." "No." The word came out small but fierce. "I'm staying with Helen and Buddy. We're a family now." "Sweetheart, it's not that simple." "Yes, it is." Josie stood up from her chair, Buddy immediately rising beside her. "Families take care of each other. Helen gave us food and made us warm and didn't yell at anybody. She's already taking care of us." Helen stepped forward, her voice steady despite the emotion building in her chest. "Ms. Rodriguez, what would be required for me to provide emergency foster care for Josie? I understand there are procedures, but surely keeping her with someone she trusts is preferable to another disruption." Ms. Rodriguez set down her pen and studied Helen with the careful assessment of someone who had seen too many well-meaning adults make promises they couldn't keep. "Mrs. Morrison, emergency foster placement requires background checks, home inspections, references, and completion of basic training modules. The process normally takes weeks or months. Then what are the alternatives? I have 3 other foster families who could take Josie tonight. They're all approved and experienced." "And Buddy?" Helen asked. Ms. Rodriguez's hesitation told Helen everything she needed to know. "The dog would need to go to animal control until we can determine proper ownership and placement." The sound that came from Josie was pure anguish, the cry of a child who had found something precious and was watching it being taken away. Buddy pressed against her legs, whimpering softly as if he understood the threat. "Please," Josie whispered. "Please don't take him away from me. He needs me." Helen made a decision that would change all their lives. "Ms. Rodriguez, I taught elementary school for 30 years. I have no criminal record, own my home outright, and can provide references from dozens of families in this community. I'm not asking to adopt Josie tomorrow. I'm asking for the chance to keep her and Buddy together while you do whatever checking you need to do. Mrs. Morrison, I lost my son 7 years ago to a stupid argument about his fears of being a good parent," Helen continued, her voice gaining strength. "I've spent those years regretting that I wasn't supportive enough when he needed me most. I won't make that mistake again. This child and this dog have already formed a bond that's keeping them both stable and safe. Separating them now would be trauma on top of trauma." Ms. Rodriguez looked from Helen to Josie, who had wrapped her arms around Buddy's neck and was looking at the adults with desperate hope. "The process for emergency placement can be expedited under certain circumstances," she said slowly. "If you're serious about this, Mrs. Morrison, I would need character references by tomorrow morning, a preliminary home safety inspection by end of week, and your commitment to work with both Josie's therapy team and any requirements we establish. For Buddy's care, yes," Helen said without hesitation, "whatever you need. And you understand this would be temporary. Josie is in state custody, and our goal is permanent placement with a family better equipped for long-term care of a child who has experienced trauma." Helen felt something inside her recoil at the phrase, better equipped. At 68, she was older than most foster parents, living alone with no recent experience raising children. But looking at Josie's face, seeing the way Buddy had positioned himself as both protector and protected, Helen knew that sometimes being equipped had less to do with circumstances and more to do with willingness to love. "I understand the temporary nature," Helen said, "but I also understand that what Josie needs most right now is stability and the assurance that the family she's chosen won't be torn apart by bureaucracy." Ms. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, making notes and clearly weighing options. When she looked up, her expression had softened slightly. "Josie, how do you feel about staying here with Mrs. Morrison while we work on finding the best long-term solution for you? Can Buddy stay too? We'll work on that. There will be requirements about veterinary care, licensing, and proof that he's not a danger to you or others." "He would never hurt me," Josie said with complete certainty. "He's the goodest dog in the world." Ms. Rodriguez actually smiled at that. "I can see that." "Okay, here's what we're going to do. Mrs. Morrison, I'm going to approve a 72-hour emergency placement while we expedite your foster approval process. You'll need to bring Josie to my office tomorrow morning to begin intake paperwork and schedule her first therapy session with Dr. Sarah Kim, who specializes in children who've experienced placement trauma." Helen nodded, already mentally organizing her schedule and the phone calls she would need to make. "Regarding the dog," Ms. Rodriguez continued, "you'll need to take him to a veterinarian for a full health and temperament evaluation within 48 hours. If he passes, and I suspect he will given how gentle he is with Josie, we can include him in the temporary placement agreement." "What if his original owner wants him back?" Helen asked. "We've already contacted the owner's family. His name was Stephen Walsh, arrested for drunken disorderly conduct and failure to appear on previous charges. He asked his brother to pick up his belongings from his apartment, including the dog. The brother said he couldn't take an animal and assumed someone would find Buddy and care for him." Ms. Rodriguez's expression showed what she thought of that assumption. "Essentially, the dog has been abandoned. If Mr. Walsh is released and wants to reclaim him, we'll deal with that then. For now, Buddy appears to be exactly where he needs to be." As if he understood that his place in the family had been secured, Buddy's tail wagged for the first time since Ms. Rodriguez had arrived. "So we can all stay together?" Josie asked, afraid to believe it. "For now, yes," Ms. Rodriguez confirmed. "Mrs. Morrison will take care of you, and you'll take care of Buddy, and we'll all work together to figure out what comes next." That evening, after Miss Rodriguez had left with a folder full of emergency paperwork and a schedule of appointments and requirements, Helen sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and a legal pad full of notes. Josie was upstairs taking her first real bath in days, and Buddy was lying by the bathroom door, standing guard even in this safe space. The next 72 hours would be crucial. Helen needed character references. That would be easy enough. With her decades of teaching and community involvement, she needed to child-proof her house and ensure it met safety requirements for foster care. She needed to take Buddy to a veterinarian and begin the process of getting him properly licensed and documented. But more than the paperwork and inspections, Helen knew she needed to prove to the system and to herself that a 68-year-old widow could provide the stability and care that a traumatized 5-year-old needed. It wasn't just about having good intentions. It was about having the energy, patience, and emotional resources to help a child heal from experiences no child should ever have to endure. The sound of Josie calling from upstairs pulled Helen from her planning. "Helen, is it okay if I use the yellow towel?" "Of course, sweetheart. Use whichever one you like." "Thank you. And Helen, can you tell Buddy I'm okay? He's whimpering outside the door." Helen climbed the stairs to find Buddy exactly as Josie had described, pressed against the bathroom door with worried brown eyes. "She's fine, boy," Helen murmured, scratching behind his ears. "Just getting clean and warm. You did a good job taking care of her." Through the bathroom door, she could hear Josie humming, the first genuinely happy sound the child had made since arriving. It was a simple melody, probably something she'd learned from a television show or another child, but it filled Helen's heart with hope. When Josie emerged from the bathroom 20 minutes later, clean and wearing one of Helen's oversized sweaters. As a makeshift nightgown, she looked like a different child. Her blonde hair, freed from tangles and dirt, curled softly around her face. Her cheeks were pink from the warm bath, and her eyes held a contentment that hadn't been there before. "Feel better?" Helen asked. Josie nodded, then surprised Helen by wrapping her small arms around her waist in a brief, spontaneous hug. "Thank you for letting us stay. Thank you for not letting them take Buddy away." Helen knelt to Josie's level, gently smoothing the child's damp hair. "Sweetheart, I want you to understand something. The next few days might be scary, with lots of appointments and people asking you questions. But no matter what happens, I promise you that Buddy will be safe, and I will never stop fighting for what's best for both of you. Even if I mess up, even if I do something wrong." The question broke Helen's heart. At 5 years old, Josie was already carrying the burden of believing that love was conditional, that safety could be lost through some failure on her part. "Especially then," Helen said firmly. "That's what families do. They stick together through the hard times and the mistakes and the days when everything goes wrong. You and Buddy have already shown me what that looks like." That night, Helen lay in her bed, listening to the sounds of her house adjusting to its new occupants. Josie was sleeping in the guest room, with Buddy stretched out on a blanket beside her bed. Occasionally, Helen could hear the soft murmur of the child talking to the dog, or the gentle thump of Buddy's tail against the floor in response. For the first time in 7 years, Helen's house didn't feel empty. It felt full of possibility, full of purpose, full of the complicated love that comes when broken souls find each other and decide to try healing together. Tomorrow would bring challenges, bureaucracy, and the beginning of a process that could go in any direction. But tonight, a little girl and a gentle dog were sleeping safely under Helen's roof, and that felt like the beginning of something beautiful. The first morning of their new routine began at 5:30 when Buddy's quiet whimpering woke Helen from the deepest sleep she'd had in months. At first she thought something was wrong, an intruder perhaps, or some emergency. But then she realized the dog simply needed to go outside and was too well-mannered to wake the sleeping child upstairs. Helen wrapped her robe around her shoulders and padded downstairs to find Buddy sitting politely by the back door, his tail giving a tentative wag when he saw her. His consideration for both Josie's sleep and Helen's house rules told her everything she needed to know about his character. "Good boy," she whispered, opening the door to let him into the fenced backyard. "Such a good boy." While Buddy attended to his morning needs, Helen started the coffee and began planning their day. The appointment with Ms. Rodriguez was at 10, followed by Josie's first session with Dr. Kim at 2. Somewhere in between, she needed to take Buddy to the veterinarian and begin the process of getting character references organized. But first, she needed to figure out how to wake a traumatized child gently, how to navigate breakfast with someone who might not trust that food would be available later, and how to help a 5-year-old understand that going to see the lady with questions didn't mean she was in trouble. Helen had raised one child, her son Michael, but that had been 37 years ago, and parenting had felt instinctive then in a way that this felt deliberate and careful. Every decision, from what to offer for breakfast to how to explain the day's schedule, carried weight because Josie's trust was still fragile, still being built one interaction at a time. When Buddy scratched softly at the door, Helen let him back in and was surprised to see Josie standing at the foot of the stairs, her blonde hair tousled with sleep and her small body swimming in Helen's oversized sweater. "Good morning, sweetheart," Helen said softly. "How did you sleep?" "Okay," Josie replied, though Helen noticed she didn't move from the stairs until Buddy trotted over to greet her. Only then did she come fully into the kitchen, her hand finding the familiar comfort of the dog's head. "Are you hungry?" I was thinking. "Pancakes, if you'd like them." Josie's eyes widened with surprise and delight. "Real pancakes? With syrup?" The question told Helen more than she wanted to know about the quality of care Josie had been receiving. "Real pancakes with real syrup," she confirmed, "and maybe some strawberries if you're interested." While Helen mixed batter and heated the griddle, Josie sat at the kitchen table with Buddy pressed against her legs, watching every movement with the intense focus of someone who wasn't used to having meals prepared with care and attention. Helen found herself narrating her actions, measuring flour, cracking eggs, explaining why she was letting the batter rest, partly to fill the comfortable silence and partly because she sensed that Josie was learning not just about pancakes, but about the rhythms of a nurturing home. "Can Buddy have some?" Josie asked as Helen flipped the first golden pancake. "Dogs can have a little bit of plain pancake, but not the syrup. Too much sugar isn't good for them." Helen had learned this from her teaching days, when students often brought pets for show and tell. "But I have some of those special dog treats we picked up yesterday. I think he'd like those better." The fact that Helen had thought to buy dog treats during their emergency shopping trip the previous evening seemed to reassure Josie in a way that words couldn't. Actions, Helen was learning, carried more weight than promises for a child who had been let down by adults before. As they ate breakfast together, Helen gently explained their schedule for the day. "We're going to see Ms. Rodriguez first, just to sign some papers and answer some questions. Then we'll take Buddy to see Dr. Martinez. She's a veterinarian who takes care of animals to make sure they're healthy and happy." "Is Buddy sick?" Josie asked with immediate concern. "No, sweetheart. But when a dog is going to live with a new family, the people who make the rules like to have a doctor check him over to make sure he's strong and healthy. It's the same reason children sometimes have to see doctors for checkups. Will they take him away if something's wrong?" Helen reached across the table and covered Josie's small hand with her own. "Buddy is going to stay with us. The doctor visit is just to make sure we're taking the best possible care of him." After breakfast, Helen helped Josie get dressed in the clothes they had hastily purchased the day before, jeans that were slightly too long, a purple sweater that Josie had chosen because it was soft, and sneakers that lit up when she walked. The simple act of watching a child discover light-up shoes reminded Helen of the small joys that made childhood special, joys that Josie had probably been denied in her previous placements. The appointment with Ms. Rodriguez went more smoothly than Helen had expected. The DCFS office was institutional and sterile, but Ms. Rodriguez's manner was warm and professional as she walked them through the paperwork required for temporary custody. Josie answered questions about her previous placements with startling honesty, describing homes where children were fed but not nurtured, where rules were enforced but love was absent. Mrs. Patterson wasn't mean on purpose, Josie explained too. Ms. Rodriguez, while Helen listened with a growing understanding of the child's resilience. She just had too many kids and not enough happy, and Mr. Patterson drank the bottles because he was sad about not having a job, but when he got sad, he got loud, and that scared everybody. Dr. Sarah Kim turned out to be a woman in her 40s, with gentle eyes and a way of talking to Josie that was respectful without being condescending. Her office was filled with toys and books, but she didn't push Josie to play with anything, instead allowing the child to explore at her own pace. While they talked, "Josie," Dr. Kim said, "I work with children who have lived in lots of different homes, just like you have. Sometimes those experiences can make kids feel confused or scared or angry, and that's completely normal. My job is to help you understand those feelings and give you ways to handle them when they feel too big." "I'm not angry," Josie said, though Helen noticed her hand tighten on Buddy's leash. "I just want to stay with Helen and Buddy." "That sounds like something very important to you. They're my family now. Real families don't leave each other." Dr. Kim glanced at Helen with the look of someone who recognized the weight that statement carried. "Can you tell me about your family before Helen and Buddy?" Josie was quiet for a long moment, and Helen watched her face work through emotions too complex for someone her age. "I don't remember my first family very much. I was little when I went to live with other people, but I remember my mom singing, sometimes, and I remember feeling safe when she held me. That sounds like a nice memory. But then she couldn't take care of me anymore, and I went to live with Miss Janet, and then Mrs. Williams, and then the Hendersons, and then Mrs. Patterson." Josie recited the list like a practiced litany. "They all said I could stay, but then something always happened and I had to leave again. That must have been very hard." "It was okay," Josie said, with the stoicism of a child who had learned not to expect too much. "But now I have Helen and Buddy and we take care of each other. That's what real families do." The veterinary appointment was a triumph. Dr. Martinez, a skilled veterinarian with 20 years of experience, pronounced Buddy to be in excellent health despite his ordeal. His shots were current, his temperament was gentle and stable, and his obvious devotion to Josie was, in Dr. Martinez's professional opinion, exactly the kind of therapeutic relationship that benefits both child and animal. "This dog has clearly been well-trained and socialized," Dr. Martinez explained to Helen, while Josie sat on the examination table with Buddy's head in her lap. "His previous owner may have had personal problems, but he took good care of his pet. Buddy's going to make an excellent companion for Josie." That evening, as Helen tucked Josie into bed with Buddy settling onto his blanket beside her, she reflected on how much they had all adjusted in just 48 hours. The child who had been rigid with fear 2 days ago now moved through Helen's house with growing confidence. She asked permission before touching things, but she asked, which meant she was beginning to trust that her requests would be received kindly. "Helen?" Josie's voice was soft in the darkened room. "Yes, sweetheart. Tomorrow when I go to school, will you and Buddy be here when I get back?" The question hit Helen like a physical blow. In all her planning and preparation, she had been so focused on the bureaucratic requirements that she hadn't fully considered the depth of abandonment fear that Josie carried. The child had been left behind so many times that even a few hours of separation felt threatening. "We will absolutely be here," Helen said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Buddy and I will be waiting for you when you get home, and we'll want to hear all about your day. Promise?" "I promise. And Josie, if you get scared at school, or if anything doesn't feel right, you ask your teacher to call me immediately. I gave them my phone number, and I can be there in 10 minutes. Josie nodded, but Helen could see she was still processing the concept. of adults who kept their promises. What if the school people don't like me? Then they don't know how lucky they are to meet someone as brave and kind as you are, Helen replied. But I think they're going to like you very much. As she turned off the light and headed downstairs, Helen caught her reflection in the hallway mirror and barely recognized herself. The woman looking back had a sense of purpose that had been missing for years, an energy that came from being needed in a fundamental way. At 68, she had thought her nurturing days were behind her. Instead, she was discovering that some types of love don't diminish with age. They deepen, becoming more patient and wise and intentional. The phone rang as she reached the kitchen, and Helen's heart jumped, immediately thinking of all the ways this fragile new arrangement could be disrupted. But the caller ID showed her friend Margaret's number. "Helen, I heard through the grapevine that you have a house guest," Margaret said without preamble. "Linda Chen mentioned that you're fostering a little girl and her dog." Helen took a deep breath, preparing for the well-meaning but worried lecture she suspected was coming. Margaret had strong opinions about appropriate behavior for women their age, and taking in a traumatized child and a stray dog definitely fell outside her comfort zone. "It's temporary," Helen said carefully, "just until social services can find a more permanent placement." "And you think that's wise? At our age?" "Helen, you're 68 years old. You haven't raised a child in decades. What do you know about modern parenting, or children who've been through trauma, or I know that she was sleeping in an alley with a dog to keep warm," Helen interrupted, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "I know that she's 5 years old and has been through 4 foster homes in 2 years, and I know that right now she's upstairs sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks because someone finally told her she could stay." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I'm just worried about you. What if she has behavioral problems? What if she's been damaged by whatever she's been through? What if you get attached and they take her away? Then I'll deal with that when it happens," Helen said. "But Margaret, you should see her with this dog. You should see the way they take care of each other. She's not damaged. She's resilient. And maybe, just maybe, I have something to offer that a younger foster family doesn't, such as time, patience, the understanding that comes from having lived long enough to know that love doesn't have to be perfect to be real." After she hung up, Helen realized that the conversation had crystallized something important for her. She wasn't fostering Josie because she was the best possible option or because she met all the standard qualifications. She was fostering Josie because sometimes the right fit has nothing to do with logic and everything to do with recognition. The moment when souls find each other and understand that they belong together, even temporarily. The next morning brought their first real test of the new routine when Josie woke up with a nightmare. Helen heard the crying at 3 a.m. and found the child sitting up in bed, shaking and calling for Buddy, who was already pressed against her side, whimpering with concern. "It's okay, sweetheart," Helen said, sitting on the edge of the bed and gathering Josie into her arms. "You're safe. You're home. Buddy's right here with you." "I dreamed they came to take us away," Josie sobbed against Helen's shoulder. "I dreamed we were back in the cold, and nobody wanted us." "That was just a dream." Dreams can feel very real, but they're not actually happening. Helen rocked gently, the way she had rocked Michael all those years ago when he had nightmares about monsters under the bed. "You're in your room, in your bed, and Buddy is right here keeping you safe." It took 20 minutes for Josie to calm down enough to lie back down, and even then, she insisted that Helen stay until she fell asleep again. As Helen sat in the darkened room, listening to the child's breathing even out while Buddy maintained his protective vigil, she understood that this was what caring for a traumatized child really meant. It wasn't just about providing food and shelter and following the rules. It was about being present in the middle of the night when terror felt more real than safety, about offering comfort without judgment, about proving through consistency that this time the adults would not disappear when things got difficult. By morning, Josie seemed to have forgotten the nightmare, chattering over breakfast about what she hoped school would be like and whether her new teacher would let her tell the class about Buddy. But Helen carried the memory of those terrified sobs, and she understood that earning a traumatized child's trust was not a single event, but an ongoing process of small proofs that safety could be counted on. Mrs. Chen appeared at Helen's back door the next morning with a casserole dish and the determined expression of someone on a mission. Helen had been expecting this visit since Margaret's phone call the night before. News traveled quickly in their neighborhood, and Linda Chen had never been one to stand on the sidelines when someone needed practical help. "I brought chicken and rice," Mrs. Chen announced, setting the dish on Helen's counter with the authority of someone who understood that feeding people was a form of love. "And I have opinions about how you're going about this foster situation." Helen braced herself for another lecture about age-appropriate behavior, but Mrs. Chen surprised her by pulling out a chair at the kitchen table and settling in with the air of someone preparing to offer strategic counsel. "Where's the child?" Mrs. Chen asked. "Getting dressed for school." "Why?" "Because I want to talk to you about how this neighborhood is going to support what you're doing, and I don't want her to hear us planning until we have everything figured out." Helen poured coffee for both of them, intrigued despite her wariness. "What kind of planning?" "The kind that ensures a 5-year-old and her dog have what they need to stay right where they are," Mrs. Chen said matter-of-factly. "Helen, I've lived next door to you for 15 years. I watched you teach half the children in this town, watched you care for Robert through his illness, watched you grieve Michael's absence like a piece of your heart had been cut out. You're not fostering that child on a whim. You're answering a calling. Linda, let me finish. Yesterday I made some phone calls to Beth Anderson, who runs the volunteer program at the elementary school, to Father Martinez at St. Mary's, who coordinates community support services, to Dr. Peterson, who's been the pediatrician for every family on this street for 20 years. Mrs. Chen counted on her fingers as she spoke. Every single one of them said the same thing. If Helen Morrison wants to foster a child, then that child has landed in the best possible place. Helen felt her eyes fill with unexpected tears. The system doesn't necessarily agree with you. There are younger families, families with more experience with traumatized children, families who might be better equipped. Better equipped with what? Energy? Helen, you taught school for 30 years. You've got more experience with children than most parents. Patience. You cared for a dying husband for 2 years without ever losing your temper or your compassion. Resources. You own your home, have a steady pension, and more common sense than people half your age. Josie appeared in the kitchen doorway, backpack on her shoulders, and Buddy at her side, interrupting the conversation. She had managed to brush her own hair, though not very successfully, and she was wearing her light-up sneakers, with evident pride. "Good morning, Mrs. Chen," Josie said politely, the manners of a child who had learned to be cautious around adults. "Good morning, sweetheart. Are you ready for your first day at your new school?" "I think so. Helen says the teacher is nice and that I can tell people about Buddy. I'm sure they'll be very interested to meet him. Dogs make everything more interesting, don't you think?" While Helen fixed Josie's hair and packed her lunch, Mrs. Chen engaged the child in easy conversation about what she hoped to learn at school, whether she liked to read, and if she had ever planted a garden. Helen watched the interaction with growing appreciation for her neighbor's wisdom. Mrs. Chen was assessing Josie's social skills, vocabulary, and emotional state, without making it feel like an interrogation. After Helen walked Josie to the bus, stop and watched her climb aboard with only minimal anxiety, she returned to find Mrs. Chen still at her kitchen table, but now with a legal pad covered in notes. "All right," Mrs. Chen said briskly. "Here's what we're going to do. First, character references. I've already spoken to Dr. Peterson, Father Martinez, Beth Anderson, and Principal Williams at the elementary school. They're all willing to write letters of recommendation for your foster application. Second, practical support. My granddaughter Emma is studying early childhood education. She can help you understand current approaches to working with children who've experienced trauma. Linda, you don't have to. Third, Mrs. Chen continued, neighborhood resources. The Kowalskis have a swing set in their backyard that they're not using since their kids grew up. Mary Sullivan runs a children's clothing exchange through the church. Tom Bradley is a retired contractor who can help with any safety modifications your house might need for the inspection. Helen stared at her neighbor with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. You organized all of this in one day? Helen, this is what communities do. When someone steps up to help a child in need, the rest of us step up to help them succeed. Mrs. Chen leaned back in her chair, her expression softening. Besides, I've seen that little girl with her dog. I've seen how she looks at you. Some things are just meant to be, and fighting them is a waste of energy. The first home inspection took place that Friday, conducted by an earnest young man named David Park, who seemed determined to find safety violations that would disqualify Helen as a foster parent. He measured the distance between stair railings, tested the temperature of the water heater, examined the locks on all the windows, and made notes about the placement of cleaning supplies and sharp objects. Helen followed him through her house with growing anxiety, seeing her familiar, comfortable home through the eyes of someone looking for reasons to say no. The stairs seemed steeper, the windows seemed lower, the kitchen knives seemed more threatening than they had that morning when she'd used one to slice apples for Josie's lunch. Mrs. Morrison, Mr. Park said as he concluded his inspection, your home is generally very well maintained, but there are several modifications that need to be made before I can approve it for foster care placement. Helen's heart sank. What kind of modifications? Safety latches on all cabinets containing cleaning, supplies or medications, outlet covers in rooms where the child will have access, a safety gate at the top of the stairs, window stops to prevent windows from opening more than 4 inches, and the dog will need to be registered with the city and have proof of liability insurance. How long do I have to make these changes? 72 hours for another inspection. That afternoon, while Josie was at school, Helen found herself standing in the hardware store with a list of safety equipment and no idea how to install most of it. The clerk, a teenager with multiple piercings and an air of supreme confidence, was explaining the difference between magnetic cabinet latches and traditional safety locks when she heard a familiar voice behind her. Helen, what are you doing? Here. She turned to find Tom Bradley, her neighbor from 3 streets over, examining a display of power tools with the experienced eye of someone who had built half the decks in the neighborhood. Tom, I'm trying to figure out how to child-proof my house for a foster care inspection, Helen explained, gesturing helplessly at her list. Apparently, my perfectly safe home is a death trap for anyone under the age of 18. Tom studied her list with the same attention he gave to blueprints. This isn't too bad. Most of it's just common-sense safety stuff. When's your inspection? Monday. Tell. You what? I'll come over tomorrow morning with my tools and help you get everything installed. My wife Mary has been through this process twice when she fostered her nieces. She can probably give you some tips about what inspectors really care about versus what they just have to check off their list. By Sunday evening, Helen's house had been transformed into a fortress of child safety. Every cabinet had safety latches, every outlet had protective covers, and a sturdy safety gate had been installed at the top of the stairs. Tom had also installed a dog door so that Buddy could access the backyard without requiring Helen to let him out, and Mary had brought over a box of children's books and toys that her own foster children had outgrown. The thing about these inspections, Mary explained as she helped Helen organize the books on a low shelf in the living room, is that they're not really about whether your house is perfect. They're about whether you're committed enough to make the necessary changes and whether you understand that fostering means putting the child's needs first. I just want them to see that Josie is safe and happy here, Helen said. Then they will. That child has blossomed in the week she's been with you. I saw her at the bus stop yesterday, and she was smiling and talking to the other kids like she belonged there. That doesn't happen with children who don't feel secure at home." The second inspection went much more smoothly. Mr. Park noted all the safety modifications, tested the latches and covers, and seemed particularly impressed by the dog door and the thoughtful way Helen had arranged Josie's bedroom to be both welcoming and secure. "Mrs. Morrison," he said as he completed his paperwork, "I'm pleased to inform you that your home meets all the requirements for emergency foster placement. I'll be recommending approval for an extended temporary arrangement while you complete the full certification process." That evening, Helen called Ms. Rodriguez to share the good news and found herself authorized to care for Josie for an additional 30 days while they worked on the paperwork for long-term placement. It felt like a reprieve, a chance to prove that age and unconventional circumstances could still create a loving home. But even as Helen celebrated this small victory, she knew that the real test was still ahead. Temporary placement was one thing. Permanent custody was another entirely. For that, she would need to prove not just that she could keep Josie safe, but that she could provide the kind of stable, nurturing environment that would help a traumatized child heal and thrive. And somewhere in the back of her mind, Helen carried the nagging worry that at 68 she might be making promises to Josie that she wouldn't be physically or emotionally able to keep. Love, she was learning, was sometimes more complicated than simply wanting what was best for someone. Sometimes it required the wisdom to know whether you were truly the person who could provide it. The discovery happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon. While Josie was at school and Helen was cleaning out the spare bedroom closet, making room for the child's growing collection of belongings. Tucked behind a box of Robert's old sweaters, she found a manila envelope she had forgotten existed. Michael's childhood artwork, saved from his elementary school years with the sentimental care of a mother who couldn't bear to throw away evidence of her child's creativity. Helen sat on the bedroom floor, surrounded by dusty boxes, and pulled out drawing after drawing. Crayon pictures of stick-figure families, watercolor paintings of their old house, construction paper cutouts of handprint, turkeys. But it was the last drawing in the stack that made her breath catch in her throat. It was a family portrait, drawn in the confident strokes of a 7-year-old who knew exactly what belonged in his world. There was Daddy, tall and brown-haired, with a big smile. There was Mommy with her yellow dress and curly hair, and there was Michael himself, small and proud in the center, holding both their hands. At the bottom of the page, in careful first-grade letters, he had written "My Family" with the backward L that had made Helen smile when she'd first seen it 30 years ago. Looking at it now, Helen felt the full weight of everything she had lost in that terrible argument 7 years ago. This little boy, who had drawn his family with such joy and certainty, had grown into a man who felt he couldn't trust his mother's love when he needed it most. The woman who had carefully saved every piece of artwork, every report card, every evidence of her child's growth had failed him at the moment when he most needed her support and confidence. But mixed with the grief was something else, a growing understanding of the parallels between Michael's fear of inadequate parenting and her own current situation with Josie. At 31, Michael had worried that he wasn't ready to be a father, that he might damage his child through inexperience or impatience. At 68, Helen was wrestling with similar fears about her ability to parent effectively after so many years, about whether love and good intentions were enough to compensate for her age and rusty skills. The phone rang, interrupting her reverie, and Helen climbed to her feet with the stiffness that reminded her daily of her advancing age. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, and she almost let it go to voicemail. But something made her answer on the 4th ring. "Hello, is this Helen Morrison?" The voice was male, tentative, familiar in a way that made her heart skip. "Yes, this is Helen." "Mom, it's Michael." Helen sank into the nearest chair, the family drawing still clutched in her free hand. "Michael," her voice came out as barely a whisper, "I know this is unexpected. I know it's been a long time. But I heard—" He paused and Helen could hear him taking a deep breath. "I heard through some neighbors that you're fostering a little girl. A friend of Sarah's saw something on social media about the court case and word got around." "Yes," Helen managed. "Her name is Josie. She's 5. Mom, I can't stop thinking about what that means, about you taking in a child at your age, and why you would do that, and whether—" Another pause, longer this time. "Whether you're trying to make up for the mistakes you think you made with me." Helen closed her eyes, feeling tears she had held back for 7 years finally spilling over. "Michael, the only mistake I made was not telling you 7 years ago what I should have said. You were going to be a wonderful father. You are a wonderful father. I was tired and scared, and I said exactly the wrong thing at exactly the wrong moment." "I've been thinking about that conversation a lot lately," Michael said softly. "Emma's 5 now, the same age as your foster daughter, and I've been watching her, watching how fearless she is, how much she trusts me to take care of her, and I realize that somehow, despite all my worrying, I didn't mess her up. She's this incredible, confident little person, and I don't know how that happened. It happened because you loved her and showed up for her every day, even when you were scared," Helen said. "That's all any parent can do. That's what I've been thinking. And Mom, if that's true, if love and showing up are what matter most, then maybe what you said 7 years ago wasn't about me not being ready. Maybe you were just scared too, scared about me growing up and starting my own family and not needing you anymore." Helen looked down at the drawing in her lap, at the confident way 7-year-old Michael had drawn himself holding his parents' hands. "I was terrified," she admitted. "I was afraid that if you started your own family, I would lose the most important role I'd ever had. And instead of supporting you, I let my fear make me say something that hurt you. I should have called sooner," Michael said. "I should have given you a chance to explain, but I was so hurt. And then Emma was born, and time just kept passing, until it felt too late to bridge the gap." "It's never too late," Helen said firmly. "Michael, I have missed you and Sarah and Emma every single day for 7 years. I have regretted that argument every single day for 7 years. If you're willing to try again, I promise you I will spend the rest of my life being the mother and grandmother I should have been all along." There was silence on the line for a long moment, and Helen held her breath, afraid that the connection had been lost, or that Michael had changed his mind. "Would you like to meet Emma?" he asked finally. "Would you like to meet your granddaughter more than anything in the world? And would you tell me about Josie, about why you decided to foster her?" Helen looked around the bedroom she was preparing. For a child who had already changed her life in ways she was still discovering. "I decided to foster her because she and her dog were sleeping in an alley in the snow, and they reminded me that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about recognizing what each other needs and choosing to provide it." "That sounds like something my mother would do," Michael said, and Helen could hear the smile in his voice. "The mother who saved every piece of artwork I ever made, even the terrible ones. I'm looking at one of those terrible ones right now." Helen laughed through her tears. "A family portrait you drew in 1st grade. You wrote 'My Family' with a backward L. I remember that one. I was so proud of it. I was proud of it too. I was proud of the little boy who drew it, and I'm proud of the man he became, and I'm sorry. It took me 7 years to tell you that." When they hung up an hour later, after making plans for Michael and his family to visit the following weekend, Helen sat in the quiet bedroom, holding the drawing and feeling as though a weight she had carried for years had suddenly been lifted from her shoulders. The conversation hadn't erased the hurt or the lost time, but it had opened a door that she had thought was permanently closed. More importantly, it had given her a new perspective on her decision to foster Josie. She wasn't trying to replace the son she had lost or compensate for past mistakes. She was simply doing what she had always done best, recognizing when someone needed care and offering what she had to give. The fact that she was older now, less energetic, more aware of her limitations didn't disqualify her from providing love. It just meant she would do it differently than she had 30 years ago, with more patience and less anxiety, with the wisdom that comes from understanding that perfect parenting is less important than present parenting. When Josie came home from school that afternoon, full of stories about her new friend Katie and the book they were reading in class, Helen found herself seeing the child with fresh eyes. Josie wasn't a second chance at motherhood or a way to fill the emptiness left by Michael's absence. She was simply a little girl who needed what Helen had to offer: a safe home, patient love, and the kind of stability that comes from an adult who has learned through experience that most problems can be solved and most wounds can heal if you give them enough time and care. "Helen," Josie said as they sat at the kitchen table working on homework while Buddy dozed at their feet. "Mrs. Patterson called today and talked to Ms. Rodriguez about me." Helen looked up from the math worksheet. They were reviewing together. "What did she say?" "Ms. Rodriguez told me that Mrs. Patterson wanted to know how I was doing, and when Ms. Rodriguez said I was happy and doing well in school, Mrs. Patterson said she was glad but not surprised." Josie looked up with the serious expression she wore when processing adult information. "Ms. Rodriguez said Mrs. Patterson told her that I was always a good kid who just needed the right family. Mrs. Patterson was right about that. Do you think she feels bad that she wasn't the right family for me?" The question showed a level of empathy and understanding that impressed Helen. Despite everything Josie had been through, she was still capable of considering other people's feelings, still capable of seeing situations from multiple perspectives. "I think Mrs. Patterson probably did the best she could with what she had," Helen said carefully. "Sometimes adults have problems that make it hard for them to take care of children the way they want to. That doesn't make them bad people, but it doesn't make it okay for children to be unhappy or unsafe either, like Mr. Patterson drinking the angry juice." "Yes, like that. Adults sometimes make choices that hurt the people around them, even when they don't mean to." Josie nodded thoughtfully, then returned to her math problems, but Helen could see her processing the conversation, filing away another piece of understanding about the complexity of adult behavior and the difference between explanation and excuse. That evening, after Josie was asleep, Helen called Ms. Rodriguez to update her on Michael's phone call and the upcoming family visit. "That's wonderful news, Helen," Ms. Rodriguez said. "Family support is one of the strongest indicators of successful long-term placement. The fact that your son is reaching out suggests that you have the kind of stable family network that benefits children in care. Does this change anything about Josie's situation? It strengthens your case significantly. When we're evaluating permanent placement options, we look at the whole family system, not just the primary caregiver. A child who has extended family members invested in her well-being has better outcomes than one who depends on a single adult, no matter how capable that adult might be." Helen hung up the phone, feeling cautiously optimistic for the first time. Since this journey had begun, the conversation with Michael hadn't just healed a 7-year-old wound, it had potentially secured Josie's future in a way that Helen's solitary efforts never could. Sometimes it seemed the most important changes happened not through grand gestures, but through the simple act of picking up the phone and saying the words that had needed to be said for far too long. The neighborhood petition began as Mrs. Chen's idea, but it quickly took on a life of its own. Helen discovered this when she found her elderly neighbor standing on her front porch on Saturday morning, with a clipboard and a determined expression that brooked no argument. "We're making this official," Mrs. Chen announced, settling into one of Helen's porch chairs as if preparing for a lengthy strategy session. "I've been thinking about your situation with Josie and about the questions that social worker is going to ask about your support system and long-term viability as a foster parent. Linda, you don't need to Helen Morrison, you are going to sit down and listen to me, Mrs. Chen interrupted, with the authority of someone who had been managing people and situations for 7 decades. I've seen what happens when good people try to do the right thing without community support. They get overwhelmed, they burn out, and children end up back in the system. That's not happening on my watch. Mrs. Chen opened her clipboard to reveal pages of signatures. Neighbors Helen barely knew, people from her old school, members of her church, former students now grown with children of their own. Each signature was accompanied by a brief statement of support, and as Helen read through them, she felt her eyes filling with tears. We, the undersigned members of the Maple Street community, wish to express our complete support for Helen Morrison's application to foster Josie. Mrs. Chen read from the cover letter. Mrs. Morrison has been a valued member of our neighborhood for 15 years, demonstrating through her actions the kind of character and commitment that makes her an ideal guardian for a child in need. The statements that followed painted a picture of Helen that she barely recognized. Helen taught my daughter Emma to read when she was struggling in 2nd grade and never charged us a penny. Signed by Tom Bradley. When my husband was in the hospital, Helen brought dinner to our family every night for 2 weeks. Mary Sullivan. Mrs. Morrison organized the neighborhood watch program that has kept our street safe for over a decade. Robert and Patricia Kowalski. But it was the final page that made Helen's breath catch. A full paragraph written in the careful handwriting of someone who had put thought into every word. I have watched Helen Morrison interact with Josie over the past 2 weeks, and I have never seen a child blossom so quickly or so completely. Josie has gone from a scared, withdrawn little girl to a confident, happy child who talks about her home and her dog, and her grandmother Helen with the kind of security that every child deserves. If the measure of good parenting is the happiness and growth of the child, then Helen Morrison is already succeeding in ways that many younger, more traditional families never achieve. Linda Chen, retired teacher, neighbor, and friend. Linda, Helen whispered, looking up from the petition with tears streaming down her cheeks. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything. Just understand that when you took in that little girl, you didn't just change her life. You reminded all of us what community really means. We're not going to let bureaucracy get in the way of something this right. The second home inspection, conducted by a different caseworker named Jennifer Walsh, reflected the community support in ways Helen hadn't expected. Miss Walsh arrived to find Tom Bradley installing a new motion sensor light by the front door for safety, Mary Sullivan dropping off a bag of clothes that her granddaughter had outgrown, and Mrs. Chen weeding Helen's front garden while keeping a careful eye on the proceedings. You seem to have a very involved neighborhood, Ms. Walsh observed, as she watched Tom explain to Josie how the new light worked to keep their house safe at night. I'm learning that I have a better support system than I realized, Helen replied. It's amazing how people step up when they see you trying to do something worthwhile. Ms. Walsh's inspection was more thorough than the previous one, but also more conversational. She asked Helen about her daily routines with Josie, her backup plans for emergencies, her strategies for handling behavioral challenges. But she also asked about the community resources Helen could access, the pediatrician who lived 2 blocks away, the retired teacher next door who could help with homework, the neighbors who had already demonstrated their willingness to provide practical support. Mrs. Morrison, Ms. Walsh said as she concluded her evaluation, I've been doing this job for 8 years, and I've seen a lot of foster situations. Some fail because the foster parents don't have adequate resources. Some fail because they don't have sufficient support systems. And some fail because they're doing it for the wrong reasons. She paused, looking around Helen's living room, where Josie was teaching Buddy to shake hands, while Mrs. Chen provided encouragement, and Tom pretended to be impressed by the dog's performance. But some situations succeed because they represent the best of what foster care is supposed to be, A child finding safety and love with adults who are committed to her well-being, supported by a community that wants to see her thrive. This is one of those situations. That evening, Helen received a call from Ms. Rodriguez with news that felt almost too good to believe. Josie's placement had been extended for an additional 60 days, with a recommendation that Helen be fast-tracked for permanent foster certification, if she chose to pursue it. "What does that mean exactly?" Helen asked. "It means that if you want to adopt Josie, and if she wants to be adopted by you, we're prepared to support that process. Your home study results are excellent. Your community support is unprecedented, and most importantly, Josie is thriving in your care in ways we rarely see this quickly." Helen sank into her kitchen chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Ms. Rodriguez was offering. "Are you saying that this could become permanent?" "I'm saying that we're prepared to begin the paperwork for permanent placement, yes. But Helen, I need you to think carefully about what you're committing to. Adoption means taking full legal and financial responsibility for Josie until she reaches adulthood. That's potentially 13 more years of active parenting, including the teenage years. At your age, that's not a decision to make lightly." After the call ended, Helen sat in her quiet kitchen and faced the question she had been avoiding since the day Josie and Buddy had appeared on her doorstep. Was she truly prepared to be a mother again at 68, with all the physical and emotional demands that entailed? The answer came to her as she heard footsteps on the stairs and looked up to see Josie padding into the kitchen in her pajamas, Buddy close behind. "I had another bad dream," Josie said simply, climbing into Helen's lap with the unconscious trust of a child who knew she would be welcomed. "Tell me about it, sweetheart." "I dreamed that I grew up and moved away, but then I came back to visit and you weren't here anymore. The house was empty and nobody remembered us." Helen held the small, warm body close and felt the answer to Ms. Rodriguez's question settle into her bones with quiet certainty. "Josie, do you know what adoption means?" "Kind of. It means you get to stay with your family forever, right? It means that you become part of the family legally and officially, so that nobody can ever separate you again. It means that even if I get old and sick, you'll still be my daughter, and I'll still be your grandmother, and there will always be people who love you and remember us." Josie was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the seriousness she brought to all important conversations. "Would you want to adopt me, even though I'm not really your granddaughter?" "Sweetheart, you are really my granddaughter, in every way that matters. Biology doesn't make families. Love makes families. And yes, if you want to be adopted, I very much want to adopt you." "What about Buddy?" "Buddy too, we're a package deal, remember? And Michael and Emma, would they be my uncle and cousin? If you want them to be, yes." Josie nestled deeper into Helen's arms, and Helen could feel the child's body relaxing as the concept of permanent belonging settled into her understanding. "I want that," Josie whispered. "I want to be your real granddaughter forever." "Then we'll make it happen," Helen promised. The next morning brought their biggest test yet, when Helen woke to find Buddy pacing anxiously outside Josie's bedroom door, whimpering softly. Inside, she found Josie burning with fever, her small body shaking with chills despite the warm room. "My throat hurts," Josie whispered when Helen touched her forehead, "and my tummy feels yucky." Helen's first instinct was panic, not about Josie's illness, which appeared to be a common childhood virus, but about her own ability to handle a sick child competently. What if she misread the symptoms? What if she waited too long to seek medical care? What if her rusty parenting skills failed when they were needed most? But as she took Josie's temperature and called Dr. Peterson's office, Helen found that caring for a sick child was like riding a bicycle. The skills came back immediately, guided by instinct and decades of experience. She knew how to make a fever more bearable with cool cloths and pediatric acetaminophen. She knew how to encourage fluid intake with popsicles and weak tea. She knew how to create the kind of quiet, comfortable environment that helped small bodies heal Most importantly, she knew how to be present in the way that sick children needed, available for comfort but not hovering, attentive to changes but not anxious, reassuring without minimizing the child's discomfort. Dr. Peterson's examination confirmed what Helen had suspected, a viral infection that would run its course in a few days with rest and fluids. But it was his conversation with Helen afterward that meant the most. "You handled this exactly right," he told her as they watched Josie doze on the examination table, with Buddy pressed protectively against her side. "You called when you should have called, you provided appropriate care at home, and you stayed calm in a way that kept Josie from becoming frightened about being sick." "I was terrified I would do something wrong," Helen admitted. "Helen, you raised a child, 37 years. Go, and you taught hundreds of children for 3 decades after that. You've forgotten more about childcare than most new parents ever learn. Trust your instincts, they're excellent." The 3 days Josie spent recovering became a gift in disguise, a chance for Helen to prove to herself that she could handle the mundane crises that came with child-rearing. She managed medication schedules and comfort measures. She entertained a bored, recovering child with quiet activities and gentle games. She coordinated with the school to collect homework and stay current with classroom activities. But most importantly, she learned that Josie trusted her completely in moments of vulnerability. When fever made the child clingy and fearful, she turned to Helen for comfort. When medication made her nauseous, she accepted Helen's care without resistance. When nightmares interrupted her healing sleep, she called for Grandma Helen with the confidence of someone who knew her needs would be met. By the time Josie returned to school the following Monday, Helen felt as though they had crossed an invisible threshold. She was no longer a temporary guardian learning how to care for someone else's child. She was a grandmother protecting and nurturing her own granddaughter with all the fierce love and determined competence that role required. The evening of Josie's first day back at school, Helen found herself in the backyard watching the child play fetch with Buddy, both of them fully recovered and glowing with health and happiness. The scene was so perfectly domestic, so utterly right, that Helen felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. At 68, she had thought her nurturing days were behind her. Instead, she was discovering that some forms of love don't diminish. With age, they deepen, becoming more patient and wise and intentional. The energy she had brought to parenting Michael had been fueled by youth and inexperience. The energy she brought to parenting Josie was fueled by wisdom and choice, by the conscious decision to offer everything she had learned about love and stability to a child who had never experienced either. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: the ongoing adoption paperwork, Michael's visit with his family, the continued process of building trust and routine. But tonight, watching her granddaughter laugh as Buddy performed his latest trick, Helen Morrison felt certain that she was exactly where she was meant to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do, at exactly the right time in all their lives. Michael's arrival came on a Saturday morning that had started like any other, with Helen making pancakes while Josie helped Buddy practice his sit and stay commands in the backyard. Helen had been nervous about this reunion for days, alternately cleaning the house obsessively and then second-guessing every decision, from what to serve for lunch to whether she should warn Josie in advance about meeting her uncle and cousin. The sound of a car door closing in the driveway made Helen's heart race, but it was Josie who noticed first, looking up from her position on the kitchen floor where she was teaching Buddy to shake hands. "Somebody's here," Josie announced, peering through the window. "There's a man and a lady and a little girl getting out of a car. That's my son Michael, his wife Sarah, and their daughter Emma," Helen explained, wiping her hands on her apron with movements that felt jerky with nervousness. "They're your uncle and aunt and cousin now, remember?" Josie's face lit up with excitement rather than the wariness Helen had expected. "Emma's my age, right? Does she like dogs?" Before Helen could answer, the doorbell rang, and Helen found herself walking toward the front door with the strange sensation of moving through a dream. 7 years of silence and hurt were about to end with the simple act of opening a door, but she felt as though she were crossing a chasm rather than traversing her familiar hallway. Michael stood on her porch looking older than she remembered, his dark hair showing threads of silver, and his face marked by the kind of laugh lines that spoke of happiness despite their years of separation. Beside him, a woman with kind eyes and auburn hair held the hand of a little girl who was indeed almost exactly Josie's age, with her father's dark hair and her mother's gentle expression. For a moment, nobody spoke. Helen looked at her son, looked at him, and saw not the angry young man who had stormed out of her kitchen 7 years ago, but the little boy who had drawn family pictures with backward letters, the teenager who had brought her dandelions from the backyard, the young father who had been so terrified of failing his child that he had sought his mother's advice. "Mom," Michael said quietly, and Helen heard in that single word 7 years of missing her. 7 years of stubborn pride, 7 years of love that had never actually disappeared, despite the silence that had buried it. "Michael," she whispered, and then she was stepping forward, and he was stepping forward, and they were holding each other in the doorway, with the fierce desperation of people who had thought they might never have this chance again. "I'm sorry," Helen said against his shoulder. "I'm so sorry for what I said, for not being the mother you needed." "No, Mom, I'm sorry. I should have called sooner. I should have given us both a chance to fix this." Michael pulled back to look at her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I've missed you so much. I've missed you too, every single day." Behind them, Helen heard Josie's voice, clear and curious. "Are you crying because you're happy or because you're sad?" Michael laughed, wiping his eyes as he turned to look at the little girl who had been watching their reunion with intense interest. "We're crying because we're happy, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups do that." "This is Josie," Helen said, putting her arm around the child who had moved to stand beside her, with Buddy pressed protectively against her legs. "Josie, this is Uncle Michael, Aunt Sarah, and your cousin Emma," who had been hiding behind her mother's legs, stepped forward with the natural boldness of a child who had always known she was loved and wanted. "Is that your dog? He's really big." "This is Buddy," Josie said, immediately warming to someone who showed interest in her. "Best friend. He's the goodest dog in the world. Do you want to pet him?" "Can I?" Emma asked, looking to her parents for permission. "Buddy's very gentle," Helen assured Sarah and Michael. "He's wonderful with children." As the two little girls knelt to lavish attention on Buddy, who was clearly delighted to be the center of such focused affection, Michael looked around Helen's living room with the expression of someone rediscovering a place he had thought lost forever. "It looks exactly the same," he said softly. "I used to dream about this room, about Sunday dinnings at that table, about sitting on this couch reading with you." "I never changed anything," Helen admitted. "I kept hoping you'd come back someday." Sarah stepped forward then, and Helen felt a moment of nervousness about meeting the daughter-in-law she had never known, the woman who had been part of Michael's life during all the years Helen had been excluded from it. "Mrs. Morrison," Sarah said warmly, "I've heard so much about you over the years. Michael talks about his childhood here, about the things you taught him, about how much he learned from watching you care for people. I've been hoping for a long time that we'd find a way back to each other." "You have?" Helen asked, surprised. "Michael's been carrying this hurt for 7 years, but he's also been carrying love. He's never stopped talking about you, never stopped missing you. When Emma was born, he would look at her and wonder if you would have been proud of the father he was becoming. When she took her first steps, he wanted to call you. When she said her first word, he almost drove over here 3 times. Helen looked at her son with new understanding. "Why didn't you?" "Pride," Michael said simply. "Hurt. Fear that too much time had passed, that you wouldn't want to see me. And honestly, Mom, fear that I wasn't good enough yet. that I still hadn't become the father you would be proud of. Michael Morrison, Helen said with all the authority of a mother who had spent decades correcting misconceptions. I have been proud of you every single day since the day you were born. What I said 7 years ago was wrong and cruel, and it came from my own fears about losing you, not from any doubt about your capacity to be an amazing father. I know that now, Michael said, but it took me 7 years and a lot of therapy to understand it. And it took hearing about Josie to realize that you weren't withholding your confidence from me. You were scared of your own ability to guide someone you loved. Helen felt tears starting again as she recognized the truth in his words. I was terrified that I would give you bad advice, that I would say the wrong thing and somehow damage your confidence or your relationship with Sarah or your bond with Emma. I'd rather have said nothing than risk making things worse. But that's not how love works, is it? Michael asked gently. Love means showing up even when you're scared, even when you might say the wrong thing. Love means taking the risk of being imperfect because the alternative is being absent. Helen looked over at Josie, who was now showing Emma how Buddy could shake hands and roll over, both little girls giggling with the instant connection that children often form. That's exactly what I've been learning with Josie. That love isn't about being perfect. It's about being present. Tell me about her, Sarah said, settling onto the couch as Emma and Josie migrated their dog training session to the living room floor. Tell me how you went from being an empty nester to fostering a 5-year-old. Over lunch, Helen told them Josie's story. The runaway night, the abandoned dog, the desperate whisper about needing family. She told them about the social workers and inspections, about Mrs. Chen's petition and the community support, about the gradual process of learning to trust each other. But mostly, Helen said, watching Josie patiently teach Emma the hand signals that made Buddy perform his tricks. It's been about discovering that family isn't just about blood or biology. It's about choosing to care for each other, about making space in your life for someone who needs what you have to offer. Michael reached across the table and covered Helen's hand with his own. Mom, I owe you an apology. When I heard about Josie, my first thought was that you were trying to replace me, trying to do over the parenting you thought you'd messed up with me. And now? Now I can see that you're not trying to replace anything. You're just doing what you've always done, opening your heart to someone who needs love. The fact that she's 5 and I'm 38 doesn't make her more important or more loved. It just makes her more immediately needy. That afternoon, while the girls played in the backyard with Buddy and Sarah helped Helen prepare dinner, Michael sat at the kitchen table and shared 7 years of stories that Helen had missed. Emma's birth, her first words, her favorite books. The challenges he and Sarah had faced in their marriage, the way parenthood had changed both of them, the gradual confidence he had built as a father. The ironic thing, Michael said, is that everything you taught me about being patient and gentle and present, all of that came back when Emma was born. I realized that you had given me exactly the foundation I needed to be a good parent, even if I was too scared to recognize it at the time. You were always going to be a wonderful father, Helen said firmly. I should have trusted that instead of letting my own anxiety make me doubt what I knew to be true. That evening, as the sun was setting and the two families were preparing to part ways with plans for regular visits, Emma approached Helen with the shy formality of a child, making an important announcement. Grandma Helen, she said, trying out the title that Josie used so naturally. Daddy says you're my real grandma now, not just Josie's pretend grandma. That's right, sweetheart. I'm grandmother to both you and Josie. And Buddy's our family dog. Buddy belongs to all of us now. Emma nodded with satisfaction, then surprised Helen by wrapping her small arms around her waist in a spontaneous hug. I'm glad we found each other again. As Michael's family drove away with promises to return the following weekend, Helen stood on her porch with Josie and Buddy, watching the taillights disappear into the gathering darkness. The little girl leaned against her side with the comfortable weight of belonging, and Buddy pressed against both their legs with the contentment of a dog who knew his family was complete. "I like having a cousin," Josie announced. "And Uncle Michael looks like you when you smile." "Does he?" "Yeah. And Aunt. Sarah is really nice. She said I can call her if I ever want to talk about girl stuff that you might not know about." Helen laughed, recognizing Sarah's tactful way of bridging the generational gap. "That sounds perfect. Grandma Helen? Yes, sweetheart? Are we going to be okay now? Are all the sad things finished?" Helen looked down at the child who had become the center of her universe, at the dog who had brought them together, at the house that had gone from empty to overflowing with love in the space of 6 weeks. "I think the sad things are finished," Helen said. "I think the good things are just beginning." But even as she spoke the words, Helen felt a small chill of apprehension. Life had taught her that happiness, once found, was precious and fragile. And something in the back of her mind whispered that their perfect new family might still face challenges they hadn't anticipated. Tomorrow would bring news that would test everything they had built together. But tonight, standing on her porch, surrounded by love, Helen chose to believe in the permanence of the joy they had created. The letter from Stephen Walsh's attorney arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by registered mail with the ominous formality that immediately told Helen something was wrong. She signed for it with hands that shook slightly, not from age, but from the premonition that their carefully constructed happiness was about to be challenged. Inside was a formal legal document stating that Mr. Walsh had completed his court-ordered rehabilitation program and was prepared to reclaim his property, specifically one golden retriever named Buddy. The letter explained that Mr. Walsh had been released from county jail the previous week, had found stable housing and employment, and was requesting the return of his dog within 14 days. Helen sank into her kitchen chair, reading the letter twice before the full implications settled into her understanding. Buddy wasn't just Josie's beloved companion. He was the foundation of the child's sense of security, the bridge that had allowed her to trust Helen, the living symbol of their unconventional family. Losing him would be devastating for Josie, but more than that, it would confirm her worst fear that nothing good in her life was permanent. "What's wrong?" Josie asked, appearing in the kitchen doorway with Buddy at her side, both of them wearing the expression of concern that came from being attuned to Helen's moods. "Nothing for you to worry about, sweetheart," Helen said, folding the letter quickly. "Just some grown-up paperwork that I need to handle." But Josie had learned to read the signs of adult distress during her years in the system, and her face immediately grew cautious. "Is it about me? Are they trying to move me again?" "Oh, Josie, this has nothing to do with your placement. You're staying right here with me, I promise." Helen's reassurance seemed to satisfy Josie, but as the child headed off to school that morning, Helen could see the shadow of worry in her eyes. Children who had experienced repeated loss developed an instinct for impending change, and Josie's radar was clearly signaling that something was amiss in their stable world. Helen spent the morning on the phone with Ms. Rodriguez, trying to understand the legal complexities of Buddy's situation. The news was not encouraging. "Helen, I'm afraid Mr. Walsh has legitimate claim to the dog," Ms. Rodriguez explained. "Buddy was never formally surrendered or abandoned in a legal sense. Mr. Walsh's brother confirmed that he was asked to care for the dog temporarily, and his inability to do so doesn't constitute abandonment. But Buddy has been living with us. For 2 months, he's bonded with Josie. Separating them now would be traumatic for both the child and the animal. I understand that, and I'm sympathetic to your situation, but animal custody follows different rules than child custody. Unless you can prove that Mr. Walsh is unfit to care for Buddy, or unless he voluntarily agrees to surrender his claim, you don't have legal grounds to keep the dog." Helen hung up the phone, feeling as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. In the space of one phone call, the family unit that had seemed so secure was suddenly under threat. Worse, she had no idea how to tell Josie that the dog who had slept beside her bed every night for 2 months might be taken away by a stranger. That afternoon, Helen found herself at Mrs. Chen's kitchen table, holding a cup of tea she didn't want, and trying to explain the situation to her neighbor's practical, analytical mind. So this man spent 2 months in jail and never once asked about his dog, but now that he's out, he wants Buddy back? Mrs. Chen asked, with the sharp tone she reserved for people who, in her opinion, were behaving unreasonably. According to his attorney, he was dealing with legal issues and assumed his brother was caring for Buddy. He claims he never intended to abandon the dog. And what does Buddy want? Has anyone considered asking the dog what he prefers? Helen almost smiled despite her distress. Linda, dogs don't get to choose their owners in custody battles. Maybe they should. That dog has been devoted to Josie since the night she found him. Anyone with eyes can see where his loyalty lies. Loyalty doesn't carry weight in legal proceedings. Mrs. Chen set down her teacup with the decisive click that usually preceded one of her strategic plans. Then we need to make sure Mr. Walsh understands what he's really asking for. He wants his dog back? Fine. But he should meet the little girl who saved that dog's life, who nursed him through loneliness and fear, who gave him a family when he had nothing. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that sometimes people make better decisions when they understand the full consequences of their actions. Mr. Walsh has every legal right to reclaim Buddy, but he also has the moral opportunity to consider what's actually best for the animal he claims to love. That evening, Helen faced the hardest conversation she'd had since Ms. Rodriguez's first visit. She waited until after dinner, when Josie was sitting on the living room floor, brushing Buddy's golden coat with the methodical care she brought to everything involving his comfort. Josie, I need to talk to you about something important. The child looked up immediately, her hand stilling on Buddy's fur. Is it bad news? Helen's heart broke at the resignation in Josie's voice, at the way a 5-year-old had already learned to brace herself for disappointment. It's complicated news. Do you remember me telling you that Buddy had an owner before you found him? The man who got arrested and left Buddy tied up? Yes. Well, that man has finished his time in jail, and he's asked for Buddy to be returned to him. Josie's face went very still, the way it had during those first days when she was trying to process information that didn't make sense. But Buddy lives with us now. Buddy is our family. I know, sweetheart. And Buddy loves living with us. But the man, his name is Mr. Walsh, says that he never meant to give Buddy away permanently. He says he wants him back. Does Buddy want to go back? Helen looked at the dog, who was watching. Their conversation with the intelligent attention he brought to all interactions that involved his beloved humans. Buddy had shown no recognition or excitement when they'd driven past Murphy's Tavern the previous week. No sign that he missed his previous life or wanted to return to it. I don't think Buddy wants to leave us, Helen said carefully, but sometimes adults have to follow rules that don't make sense to children or dogs. Josie's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. Are you going to let him take Buddy away? I'm going to try very hard to find a way for Buddy to stay with us. But Josie, I need you to understand that I might not be able to stop this from happening. Why not? You stopped them from taking me away. You made them let me stay. Helen knelt beside Josie and Buddy, gathering both child and dog into her arms. The rules for children are different from the rules for dogs, sweetheart. With you, I could prove that keeping our family together was what was best for everyone. With Buddy, the law says that people own their pets, even if those pets might be happier somewhere else. That's not fair, Josie whispered, and Helen heard in those 3 words all the accumulated disappointment of a childhood spent learning that fairness was not a principle that governed adult decisions. No, it's not fair. But sometimes when things aren't fair, we have to find ways to make them better. Mrs. Chen and I are working on a plan to help Mr. Walsh understand how much Buddy means to our family. That night, Helen lay awake listening to the sounds of Josie talking quietly to Buddy in the next room, probably explaining the situation in the straightforward way that children communicate important information to their pets. The soft murmur of the child's voice, punctuated by Buddy's gentle responses and the occasional creak of the bed as he adjusted his position to stay close to her, reminded Helen of how much they all had to lose. The next morning brought a call from Michael, who had heard about the situation from Mrs. Chen and was prepared to offer whatever support Helen needed. "Mom, I've been thinking about this all night," he said. "What if I contact Mr. Walsh directly, lawyer to lawyer, but also as someone who understands what this family means to Josie?" "Michael, you don't have to get involved in this." "Yes, I do. Josie is my family now, which means Buddy is too. And more than that, I've seen what happens when pride and stubbornness keep families apart. I'm not going to let that happen to you and Josie if there's anything I can do to prevent it." Dr. Kim, when Helen called to discuss how to help Josie cope with the potential loss, was even more direct in her assessment. Helen, removing Buddy from Josie's life right now would undo months of progress, Dr. Kim said. That dog represents security, consistency, and unconditional love for a child who has experienced repeated abandonment. Losing him wouldn't just make her sad. It would confirm her deepest fear that attachment leads to loss. Is there anything we can do from a therapeutic standpoint? Any way to document how essential Buddy is to Josie's emotional well-being? I can write a letter explaining the psychological impact of separation. But Helen, you need to understand that this isn't just about Josie anymore. Buddy has become integral to your family system. You've all bonded around caring for each other, and losing him would affect the entire dynamic. That afternoon, Helen received an unexpected call from Stephen Walsh himself. His voice was rough, from years of cigarettes and alcohol, but it carried a note of genuine uncertainty that gave Helen hope. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm Steve Walsh. I understand you've been taking care of my dog." "Yes, Mr. Walsh, Buddy has been living with us since January. Look, I know this is complicated. My lawyer says I got every right to get him back, but I've been thinking about the situation, and I wanted to talk to you directly." Helen felt her heart rate accelerate. "What would you like to know?" "I guess I want to know if he's happy. Buddy was a good dog, but I wasn't always a good owner. I was drinking too much, making bad choices, and he probably suffered for it. If he's found a better situation—" Helen chose her words carefully, knowing that this conversation might determine Buddy's future. "Mr. Walsh, Buddy is very happy here. He's healthy and loved, and he's become especially important to my foster daughter, who is 5 years old. They take care of each other." There was a long pause on the line. "A little girl?" "Yes. Her name is Josie. She found Buddy the night you were arrested, and they've been inseparable ever since. She's been through a lot in her short life, and Buddy has given her the kind of security that's allowed her to start healing." Another pause, longer this time. "Mrs. Morrison, would it be possible for me to come see him, see how he's doing? I don't want to upset nobody, but I need to make sure I'm doing the right thing." Helen felt a surge of hope mixed with apprehension. "Of course, Mr. Walsh. When would you like to come?" "How about tomorrow evening? After the little girl gets home from school. I think I need to see them together." As Helen hung up the phone, she realized that Buddy's fate, and by extension their family's wholeness, would be decided not in a courtroom, but in her living room, by a man who was questioning his own motives and a dog whose loyalty would be tested in front of the people he had chosen to love. Stephen Walsh arrived at 5:30 on Thursday evening, driving a battered pickup truck that had seen better decades, and walking with the careful gait of a man who had learned hard lessons about the consequences of poor choices. Helen watched him through her front window as he sat in his truck for several minutes, gathering courage or reconsidering his decision, before finally climbing out and walking slowly toward her front door. He was younger than Helen had expected, probably in his early 40s, with prematurely grey hair and the weathered face of someone who had lived roughly. But his eyes held a clarity that suggested sobriety was real and intentional, and when he knocked on her door, It was with the gentle restraint of someone who understood he was entering a delicate situation. "Mr. Walsh," Helen said, opening the door with more calm than she felt. "Please come in." "Thank you, Mom, and please call me Steve." Helen led him into the living room, where Josie sat on the floor doing homework with Buddy, stretched out beside her, serving as both pillow and study companion. At the sound of unfamiliar footsteps, both child and dog looked up with the alert attention they had learned during their early days of wariness. Buddy's reaction was immediate and telling. His ears perked forward, and his tail gave a tentative wag, recognition without excitement, acknowledgement without enthusiasm. He knew this man, but he made no move to leave Josie's side or approach his former owner. "Buddy," Steve said softly, and Helen could hear years of shared history in the way he spoke the dog's name. "Hey there, boy." Buddy's tail wagged harder, but he remained pressed against Josie, who had wrapped her arm protectively around his neck while studying the stranger with the serious evaluation children bring to adults whose intentions are unclear. "Josie," Helen said gently, "this is Mr. Walsh. He's the person who owned Buddy before you found him." Josie's grip on Buddy tightened slightly, but her voice was polite when she spoke. "Hello, Mr. Walsh. Did you come to visit Buddy?" Steve knelt down to Josie's eye level with movements that suggested experience with children, though Helen couldn't tell if it came from parenting or simply from the kind of rough life that taught people to be careful around those smaller and more vulnerable than themselves. "Hello, Josie. Yes, I came to see how Buddy is doing. I heard that you've been taking very good care of him." "I have," Josie said with quiet pride. "I brush his fur every day and make sure he has fresh water and take him for walks, and he sleeps next to my bed to keep me safe from bad dreams." Steve's expression softened as he watched the easy familiarity between child and dog. "That sounds like you're a very good friend to him." "He's my best friend," Josie said simply. "We take care of each other." "Can you tell me about that? About how you take care of each other?" Josie glanced at Helen, who nodded encouragingly, then looked back at Steve with the earnest expression she wore when explaining something important. "Well, when I found Buddy, he was cold and scared and lonely just like me, so I untied him and we kept each other warm all night. And now when I have nightmares, he comes close to me and makes me feel safe. And when he's scared of loud noises, like thunderstorms, I pet him and tell him everything's okay." Steve listened with the focused attention of someone hearing information that would influence a difficult decision. "And before you found Buddy, where did you live?" "Lots of places," Josie said matter-of-factly, "but they weren't really home. This is home, with Grandma Helen and Buddy." "What makes this home different?" Helen found herself holding her breath as Josie considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Here, nobody yells at me or gets angry when I make mistakes. Grandma Helen helps me with my homework and reads me stories and makes me pancakes. And Buddy is always happy to see me, even when I'm sad or scared. We're a family now." Steve was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between Josie and Buddy, taking in the way the child's hand rested naturally in the dog's fur, the way Buddy's body was angled to provide comfort and protection, the obvious bond that had formed between them. "Buddy looks good," he said finally. "Healthy and happy." "Dr. Martinez says he's in perfect health," Helen offered. "He's up to date on all his vaccinations, and he's been trained as a therapy dog. He helps other children too sometimes." "A therapy dog?" "He visits the hospital with Josie and me once a week. There are children there who are scared or lonely, and Buddy seems to understand exactly how to comfort them." Steve's eyebrows rose with surprise and something that might have been pride. "He always was good with people who needed help, even when I was—" He paused, glancing at Josie. "Even when I wasn't taking good care of myself, Buddy would try to take care of me." "He's still like that," Josie said. "When Grandma Helen got sick last month, Buddy stayed right beside her bed until she felt better." "You got sick?" Steve asked, Helen with genuine concern. Just a mild flu, but Buddy appointed himself as my personal nurse. He wouldn't leave my side for 3 days. Steve stood up slowly, his hands hanging loose at his sides, in a gesture of uncertainty. Would it be okay if I sat with him for a few minutes, just to see how he reacts? Helen looked at Josie, who nodded reluctantly. You can sit with us, Josie said, but Buddy might not remember you very well. He's used to living with us now. Steve settled onto the couch, and after a moment's hesitation called softly, Come here, Buddy. Come see me, boy. Buddy looked up at Steve, then at Josie, then back at Steve. Slowly he rose from his position beside Josie and approached his former owner with the cautious curiosity of a dog who remembered kindness but also remembered abandonment. Steve extended his hand for Buddy to sniff, and the dog's tail began to wag more enthusiastically as familiar scents triggered memories of better times. For a moment, Helen thought Buddy might choose Steve over Josie, might demonstrate a loyalty that would make the custody decision simple. But instead, after greeting Steve with polite affection, Buddy returned to Josie's side, pressing against her with the clear intention of providing comfort to the child, who was obviously distressed by the situation. He remembers you, Josie said quietly, but he knows he belongs with me now. Steve watched this interaction with an expression that cycled through recognition, sadness, and something that might have been relief. Yeah, he said softly. I think he does know that. The three of them sat in Helen's living room for another 20 minutes, with Steve asking careful questions about Buddy's routine, his health, his training, his role in their family. Josie answered each question honestly, painting a picture of a dog who was not just cared for but cherished, not just housed but truly home. Mr. Walsh, Josie said as the conversation began to wind down, are you going to take Buddy away from us? The directness of the question clearly caught Steve off guard, and Helen watched him struggle with an answer that would be honest without being cruel. I don't know yet, sweetheart, he said finally. I need to think about what's best for Buddy. What's best for Buddy is staying with people who love him, Josie said with the clear logic of childhood. We love him so much that we would never leave him tied up alone when he was scared. The words hit Steve like a physical blow, and Helen saw him flinch as he recognized the accusation hidden in Josie's simple statement. He had left Buddy tied up and alone, and a 5-year-old child had been the one to rescue his dog from the consequences of his poor choices. You're right, Steve said quietly. I did leave him alone when he needed me. I made a lot of bad choices back then, and Buddy suffered for them. But you're better now? Josie asked with the hope of a child who wanted to believe that adults could change and grow. I'm trying to be better. I've been sober for 4 months. I have a job. I have a place to live. But Josie, being better doesn't erase the mistakes I made before. Helen found herself unexpectedly moved by Steve's honesty with Josie, by his willingness to acknowledge his failures without making excuses for them. This was not the selfish, irresponsible pet owner she had imagined, but a man who was genuinely trying to figure out how to do right by an animal he cared about. Mr. Walsh, Helen said carefully, would you like to stay for dinner? It's nothing fancy, just spaghetti and salad, but you're welcome to join us. Steve looked surprised by the invitation, then grateful. Are you sure? I don't want to impose. You're not imposing. I think it would be good for all of us to spend a little more time together before any decisions need to be made. During dinner, Steve shared pieces of his history with Buddy, how he'd adopted the dog as a puppy from a shelter, how Buddy had been his companion through some very difficult years, how the dog's loyalty had been one of the few constants in a life marked by instability and poor choices. I want you to understand, he told Helen and Josie over dessert, that giving him up the first time wasn't intentional. I thought my brother would take care of him while I got my life sorted out. When I found out he'd just left Buddy to fend for himself, I was devastated. But you didn't come looking for him right away, Helen observed gently. No, I didn't. By the time I got out and tracked down what had happened, I heard that he'd been found by a family who was taking good care of him. Part of me was relieved that he was safe and happy, even if it meant he wasn't with me. "So why are you here now?" Josie asked, with the blunt curiosity of childhood. Steve set down his fork and looked directly at the little girl who had rescued his dog, and was now challenging him to explain himself. "Because my lawyer told me I had the right to get him back, and I started thinking maybe I deserved another chance to be a better owner than I was before." "Do you think you deserve Buddy?" "More than we do?" Josie asked. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Helen held her breath as Steve considered his answer. This moment, she realized, would determine not just Buddy's fate, but the kind of man Steve Walsh was choosing to become. "No," he said finally. "No, I don't think I deserve him more than you do. You saved his life, Josie. You gave him a family and a home and the kind of love he always deserved, but didn't always get from me." Helen felt a surge of hope. But Josie wasn't finished with her interrogation. "Then why can't you just let him stay with us?" Steve rubbed his face with both hands, the gesture of a man wrestling with a decision that had no easy answers. "Because I love him too, sweetheart. Because he was my family for 6 years before he became yours. Because letting go of someone you love, even when it might be the right thing to do, is one of the hardest things a person can ever face." The conversation that would determine Buddy's fate began after Josie had been tucked into bed, with Helen and Steve sitting in her living room while Buddy lay between them, sensing the tension in the air. Through the ceiling, they could hear the soft murmur of Josie's voice as she read bedtime stories to her stuffed animals, a routine that had evolved over their months together. "She reads to her toys every night," Helen said softly. "Stories. About families who stay together, about lost things being found, about love that doesn't disappear when times get hard." Steve nodded, his eyes fixed on Buddy, who was watching both adults with the intelligent awareness that had always made him an exceptional companion. "He used to sleep on my bed," Steve said quietly. "When the nightmares got bad, from the war and from the drinking, he'd wake me up and stay close until I calmed down." "You served in the military? 2 tours in Afghanistan. Came back different than I left, like a lot of us did. Buddy helped with that, but not enough to stop me from making the mistakes that landed me in jail." Helen studied Steve's profile in the lamplight, recognizing the kind of pain that couldn't be fixed with good intentions or simple solutions. "What happened, if you don't mind me asking?" "Drunk and disorderly, failure to appear, driving under the influence." Steve recited the charges without emotion. "I was angry all the time, drinking too much, picking fights with anyone who looked at me wrong. The night they arrested me, I was so drunk I barely remember tying Buddy up behind that bar. I thought I'd be back in a few hours, and instead, I spent 2 months in county lockup, followed by court-ordered rehab. By the time I got out, Buddy had been living with you for almost as long as he'd been living with me after I got back from rehab." Helen watched Buddy's ears perk up at the sound of his name, watched the way he looked between the two humans, as if following their conversation. "Steve, can I ask you something difficult?" "Go ahead." "If you take Buddy back, what kind of life can you offer him?" "Really?" Steve was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I have a studio apartment in a building that allows pets. I work construction. Good, steady work, but long hours. Buddy would be alone most days, probably bored and lonely until I got home. And here, he's got a little girl who adores him, a grandmother who spoils him, a neighborhood full of people who know his name. He's got a yard to play in, other children to visit at the hospital, a routine that makes him feel useful and loved." Steve looked directly at Helen. "Here, he's got the family I always wanted to give him but never figured out how to build. Then why are we having this conversation? Because giving him up means admitting that I failed him completely. Because it means accepting that someone else could love him better than I did, could take better care of him, could be the owner he deserved all along." Helen leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Steve, loving someone doesn't always mean keeping them. Sometimes it means recognizing when they've found something better than what you can provide and having the courage to let them flourish there. Is that what you think I should do? I think you should do whatever allows you to look at yourself in the mirror and know that you put Buddy's well-being ahead of your own wants. Steve stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street where Helen had built a life of stability and community. You know what the hardest part is? Seeing him with Josie, seeing how happy he is, and knowing that I never made him that happy. Even in our best times when I was sober and trying to be a good owner, he never looked as content as he does with that little girl. That doesn't mean you didn't love him well. It means he found a different kind of love, one that fits his needs in a way your love couldn't. A 5-year-old child is a better dog owner than I ever was. A 5-year-old child who has experienced loss and abandonment knows exactly what Buddy needs to feel secure and loved. They understand each other in a way that's probably healing for both of them. Steve turned back toward Helen, his expressions cycling through emotions too complex to name. If I let him stay, what happens to me? How do I go home to an empty apartment and build a life that doesn't include the one living thing that's been loyal to me through everything? Helen felt her heart break a little for this man who was discovering that sobriety meant facing not just his mistakes, but also his loneliness. You find other ways to build connection and meaning. You volunteer with animals or veterans or children who need mentors. You take the love you have for Buddy and find ways to share it with others who need it. And you really think that's what's best for him, staying here? Before Helen could answer, they heard the soft pad of footsteps on the stairs, and Josie appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, Buddy immediately rising to greet her. I couldn't sleep, Josie said, wrapping her arms around Buddy's neck. I kept thinking about Mr. Walsh taking Buddy away. Steve knelt down to Josie's level, his face serious but kind. Josie, I want you to know that whatever I decide, it won't be because you haven't taken good care of Buddy. You've given him the best home he's ever had. Then why would you take him away from the best home he's ever had? Josie asked with devastating logic. Because sometimes adults make decisions based on what they think they deserve, instead of what's actually best for everyone involved. Josie studied Steve with the intense focus she brought to all important conversations. My mom gave me away because she couldn't take care of me properly. She said it was the hardest thing she ever did, but she did it because she loved me. Helen watched Steve's face as Josie's words hit him with their simple truth. Do you love Buddy enough to let him stay where he's happiest? Josie continued, even if it makes you sad. Steve closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, Helen could see that the decision had been made. Yeah, sweetheart, I love him that much. So he can stay. He can stay. But Josie, I want you to promise me something. What? I want you to promise that you'll always remember that Buddy had another family before you, and that giving him up was the hardest thing that family ever did. Can you remember that he was loved before he found you, even if that love wasn't perfect? I promise, Josie said solemnly. And Mr. Walsh, maybe you could visit sometimes if you want to. Buddy would probably like that, and I could show you all the tricks he's learned. Steve's eyes filled with tears as he looked at this remarkable child who was offering him a way to say goodbye without losing connection entirely. I would like that very much. The next morning, Steve returned with a folder full of Buddy's veterinary records, his registration papers, and a formal letter relinquishing all claim to the dog. But he also brought something else, a photo album filled with pictures of Buddy, as a puppy, as a young dog, through the years they had spent together. I want Josie to have these, he told Helen, so she knows his whole story, not just the part that begins with her. The legal transfer was handled quickly and quietly, with Michael's help to ensure that all the paperwork was properly filed. Within a week, Buddy was officially registered as Helen's dog, with Josie listed as his primary caretaker. But more important than the legal documents was the conversation Steve had with Josie before he left that final morning. Thank you, he told her as she sat on the front porch with Buddy at her side. "Thank you for saving him when I couldn't. Thank you for loving him the way he deserved to be loved. And thank you for reminding me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let go. Are you going to be okay?" Josie asked with the empathy of someone who understood what it meant to lose family. "I'm going to try to be. And knowing that Buddy is happy and safe with people who love him as much as I do, that's going to make it easier." As Steve's truck disappeared down Maple Street for the last time as Buddy's owner, Helen sat on her porch swing, with Josie curled against her side and Buddy stretched across both their laps. The weight of the dog, the warmth of the child, the security of their officially recognized family unit, it all felt like the resolution of conflicts Helen hadn't even realized she was carrying. "Grandma Helen?" Josie said softly. "Yes, sweetheart? I'm glad Mr. Walsh loved Buddy enough to let him stay with us. That's what real love does, right? It wants the person to be happy, even if it makes you sad." Helen thought about Michael, about the years of silence that had finally been broken by the simple act of reaching out. She thought about Robert, about the way he had faced his illness with grace, because he knew his family would carry on his love even after he was gone. She thought about her own decision to foster Josie, despite all the practical arguments against it. "Yes, sweetheart," Helen said, stroking Josie's hair as Buddy's tail thumped contentedly against the porch. "That's exactly what real love does." 6 months later, Helen Morrison's house on Maple Street had transformed into the kind of home that neighborhood children gravitated toward, the one with the welcoming front porch, the patient grandmother, and the golden retriever who seemed to understand that his job was to make everyone feel loved and safe. The official adoption papers had been finalized in April, with Josie sitting in the judge's chambers wearing her best dress and holding Buddy's leash, solemnly promising to be a good daughter to Helen and a good friend to everyone who needed one. Michael and his family had been there, along with Mrs. Chen, Ms. Rodriguez, and half the neighborhood, turning what could have been a bureaucratic procedure into a celebration of the family they had all watched form and grow. Now, on a warm September morning that marked the anniversary of their first meeting, Helen stood at her kitchen window, watching Josie teach Emma and 2 other neighborhood children how to properly brush Buddy's coat. At 6, Josie had grown taller and more confident, but she had retained the gentle patience that made her a natural caretaker and the kind of friend other children sought out. "More like this, see?" Josie was explaining to 5-year-old Marcus from 3 houses down, guiding his small hand as he worked the brush through Buddy's golden fur. "You have to be gentle, because even though dogs have thick fur, their skin can be sensitive just like ours." Buddy endured this multi-child grooming session with the patient dignity of a therapy dog who understood his role in helping children learn kindness and responsibility. His work at the hospital had expanded to include visits to the elementary school, where he helped anxious students practice reading aloud and provided comfort to children who were struggling with family changes or academic challenges. "He's like a teacher," Marcus observed, which made Josie beam with pride. "He is a teacher. He teaches people that love doesn't have to be scary and that families can be made in all different ways." Helen smiled at her granddaughter's wisdom, still amazed by the depth of understanding that Josie had developed about relationships, loyalty, and the different forms that love could take. The child who had once been afraid to trust that good things could last had become someone who helped others believe in the possibility of permanence and security. The sound of a car in the driveway announced Michael's arrival for their weekly Sunday dinner, a tradition that had evolved naturally as their reunited family settled into new rhythms. Helen watched him get out of his car and immediately be surrounded by the pack of children, all eager to tell him about their week and show off their latest training successes with Buddy. "Uncle Michael! Uncle Michael!" Emma called, running to greet her father. "Josie taught me how to make Buddy roll over, and Marcus learned how to make him shake hands." "That's wonderful," Michael said, scooping up his daughter and nodding seriously at Marcus, who was demonstrating the handshake technique. With professional pride, Buddy's lucky to have such dedicated students. Sarah emerged from the passenger seat, carrying a covered dish and wearing the relaxed expression of someone who had found her place in an extended family that included not just in-laws and children, but also neighbors who felt like relatives, and a golden retriever who had become everyone's beloved uncle. "How's our favorite therapy dog?" Sarah asked, kneeling to receive Buddy's greeting. "Still helping everyone feel better about themselves?" "He visited Mrs. Patterson yesterday," Josie announced, and Helen felt the familiar surge of pride mixed with amazement that still accompanied references to Josie's former foster mother. The relationship with Mrs. Patterson had been one of the unexpected developments of the past months. After learning about Josie's successful placement and adoption, Mrs. Patterson had reached out through Ms. Rodriguez to apologize for the circumstances that had led to Josie running away. The conversation that followed had revealed a woman overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control, struggling with her own husband's alcoholism and the challenge of caring for multiple foster children without adequate support. "How is Mrs. Patterson doing?" Michael asked as they moved toward the house, children and dogs swirling around them like a happy tornado. "Better," Josie said. "She got rid of Mr. Patterson because he wouldn't stop drinking the angry juice, and now she only takes care of one foster kid at a time so she can do it properly. Tommy lives with her now, and he's much happier because she has time to help him with his bedwetting instead of getting mad about it." Helen marveled, not for the first time, at Josie's ability to understand complex adult situations and find compassion for people who had failed her in the past. The therapy sessions with Dr. Kim had helped, but Helen suspected that Josie's natural empathy and resilience were equally responsible for her emotional growth. During dinner, the conversation flowed easily between family updates, community news, and the kinds of silly stories that made everyone laugh. Marcus stayed for the meal at his grandmother's request, and his presence added to the sense that this house had become a gathering place for anyone who needed the particular kind of acceptance that Helen, Josie, and Buddy provided. "Grandma Helen," Emma said as they were clearing the table, "Marcus doesn't have a dog. Can he share Buddy sometimes?" "Buddy belongs to everyone who needs him," Helen replied, a response that had become her standard answer to questions about Buddy's availability. "That's what therapy dogs do. They share their love with anyone who needs it." After dinner, while the children played in the backyard and the adults lingered over coffee, Michael brought up a conversation he and Helen had been having about the future. "Mum, Sarah, and I have been talking about the possibility of becoming foster parents ourselves, not to replace what you and Josie have built, but to expand it, to be part of the network that helps children find safe places to land." Helen looked at her son with the kind of pride that comes from watching someone you love choose to serve others. "What made you decide that?" "Watching you with Josie. Seeing what happens when someone is willing to take a risk on a child who needs family, understanding that love multiplies instead of dividing when you share it with more people." "And Emma, how does she feel about the idea of sharing her parents with other children?" "She's excited," Sarah said. "She wants to be a big sister to kids who need one, the way Josie has become a big sister figure to her friends." That evening, after Michael's family had gone home and Marcus had been collected by his grandmother, Helen found herself in the familiar position of tucking Josie into bed, while Buddy arranged himself on his blanket beside her bed. The routine had evolved over the months to include more conversation and less anxiety, but it remained one of Helen's favorite parts of the day. "Grandma Helen," Josie said, as Helen straightened her covers, "do you think Mr. Walsh ever thinks about Buddy and wishes he had made different choices?" The question showed the kind of thoughtful consideration that Josie brought to most aspects of life, the ability to hold compassion for multiple people even when their needs conflicted. "I think he probably does," Helen said, "but I also think he feels good knowing that Buddy is happy and loved and doing important work helping other people. I think about him sometimes, Not sad thinking, just remembering thinking, like how Buddy had a whole life before he met us, and that's part of his story too. Helen sat on the edge of Josie's bed, struck by the wisdom of a 6-year-old who understood that love could honor the past while embracing the present. That's a very mature way to think about it, sweetheart. Mrs. Chen says that's what makes families strong, when everyone remembers that they all have stories that happened before they found each other, and they respect those stories even when they're different from their own. Mrs. Chen is very wise. She says you're wise too. She says you knew how to love me and Buddy, even when the rules said it might be complicated. Helen smoothed Josie's hair, still amazed by the journey that had brought them together. I think we all knew how to love each other. We just needed to be brave enough to try. Are you glad we were brave? Helen looked around the bedroom that had been a guest room 6 months ago, and was now unmistakably Josie's space, filled with books and art supplies and photographs of their expanding family. She listened to the sounds of the house settling around. Them, no longer empty, but full of the quiet contentment that comes from people who know they belong together. I'm grateful every single day that we were brave enough to become a family, Helen said. Even when it was scary, even when we didn't know how it would work out, even when other people thought we were making mistakes. Me too, and Buddy too, I think. As if summoned by his name, Buddy lifted his head from his blanket and thumped his tail against the floor, the canine equivalent of agreement. Good night, my darling girl, Helen said, kissing Josie's forehead. Sweet dreams. Good night, Grandma Helen. Good night, Buddy. Tomorrow we're going to teach the new kids at the hospital how to be gentle with dogs, right? That's right. You're going to help them learn that love doesn't have to hurt, and that some friends have 4 legs and golden fur. Helen turned off the light and headed downstairs, but she paused on the landing to look back at the door behind which her granddaughter and their dog were settling into sleep. Through the slight gap, she could hear Josie's soft voice as she shared the events of the day with Buddy, a ritual that seemed to help them both process their experiences and prepare for whatever tomorrow might bring. In her own bedroom later, Helen opened the drawer where she kept Josie's adoption papers and the formal document that had made Buddy legally theirs. But tucked behind those official records was something else, a letter that had arrived 2 weeks ago from Stephen Walsh, written in careful handwriting on plain paper. Dear Mrs. Morrison and Josie, it began. I hope you don't mind me writing, but I wanted you to know that I think about Buddy often, and I'm so grateful that he found his way to your family. I'm doing well, 8 months sober now, and I've started volunteering at the animal shelter where I adopted Buddy 7 years ago. It turns out there are a lot of dogs and cats who need temporary homes while their owners get back on their feet. And I'm good at that kind of short-term care. It's helping me understand the difference between loving someone and being the right person to take care of them. Thank you for showing Buddy and me what that difference looks like. Please give him a pat for me and tell him his old friend Steve hopes he's still making people smile. With gratitude, Stephen Walsh. Helen had read the letter to Josie, who had listened thoughtfully and then asked if they could send Mr. Walsh a picture of Buddy at work in the hospital. The photograph they'd chosen showed Buddy lying beside a young boy's hospital bed, his head resting gently on the child's arm, while the boy read aloud from a picture book. On the back, Josie had written in her careful first-grade handwriting, Dear Mr. Walsh, Buddy is very happy, and he helps lots of people feel better. Thank you for loving him enough to let him stay with us. Love, Josie and Buddy and Grandma Helen. Now, looking at Steve's letter in the lamplight beside her bed, Helen reflected on the unexpected ways that love could evolve and expand. A year ago, she had been a lonely widow, living in a house too big for one person, carrying regrets about her relationship with her son and facing the prospect of growing old without purpose or connection. Today, she was the grandmother of a remarkable little girl, the owner of a therapy dog who brought joy to dozens of people every week, the center of a family that included not just blood relatives, but chosen relatives and community members who had become essential to their daily happiness. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to serve, to love, to help others find their own version of the family that had saved all of them. Mrs. Chen was already talking about Helen and Josie hosting a support group for other foster families in the neighborhood. Dr. Kim had suggested that Josie's insights about healing and trust might help other children who were struggling with placement issues. And somewhere in the future, Helen could envision other children who might need temporary or permanent homes. The families who might benefit from the kind of unconditional acceptance that she and Josie had learned to offer each other. At 69, Helen Morrison had discovered that some chapters of life don't end. They expand, creating space for more love, more purpose, more connection than seemed possible when those chapters began. The little girl who had whispered, "You need a friend, and I need a family," to a shivering dog in a snowy alley had been speaking not just for herself and Buddy, but for all of them. For Michael and Sarah and Emma, for Mrs. Chen and the neighbors, for Stephen Walsh and Mrs. Patterson, and the countless other people whose lives had been touched by their decision to choose each other. Helen turned off her bedside lamp and settled into sleep with the profound contentment that comes from knowing you are exactly where you belong, doing exactly what you were meant to do, surrounded by the people and animals who make life worth living. In the morning, there would be pancakes to make, children to nurture, and love to share. Tonight, there was the peaceful silence of a house filled with family and the certain knowledge that some stories don't end. They simply continue, growing richer and more beautiful with each passing day.